The Arizona sun beat down on Mercy Ranch like God's own judgment. The parched earth cracked open, thirsting for rain that hadn't fallen in 4 long months. But Eve Morgan had weathered worse droughts than this, droughts of the land and droughts of the soul. At 46, she had buried more than most her husband, her dreams of prosperity and a past so blood-soaked that few would believe the quiet widow had lived it. All that remained was this failing patch of dirt, a weathered farmhouse, and shadow her prized Appaloosa horse, the last gift from her late husband, Marcus. Eve wiped sweat from her brow as she finished securing the paddock gate. Her calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the arthritis that had begun to settle in her joints. The years of honest living hadn't completely softened her, but they had changed her in ways she rarely contemplated. "Gonna be another scorcher today, Shadow," she murmured, stroking the horse's dappled neck. The animal nickered softly in response, dark eyes regarding Eve with the familiarity of a companion. Rather than livestock, Shadow represented far more than just an animal to Eve. After Marcus died of heart failure, last winter the horse had become both livelihood and company in the crushing loneliness of Mercy Ranch, a championship bloodline worth more than everything else she owned combined. Eve squinted at the horizon where heat waves distorted the distant mountains. Her hand instinctively reached for the worn Winchester rifle that never strayed far from her side. 20 years of honest living hadn't dulled those instincts. Riders approaching at dusk rarely brought good tidings, especially not in these borderlands where desperation bred predators. "Sheriff Alvarez said the Mitchell place got hit last night," she told Shadow, her voice carrying the faint traces of a Texas accent that 2 decades in Arizona hadn't quite erased. "Third farm this month." The drought had pushed desperate men to desperate measures. Cattle rustling, once a relic of the Old West, had returned to the border counties. The local law enforcement was stretched thin, leaving remote homesteads like hers to fend for themselves. Eve checked her watch, a practical, no-nonsense timepiece, and headed toward the house. The modest structure had stood for nearly 70 years, weathering dust storms and flash floods. Marcus had been fixing it up bit by bit before the cancer took him another unfinished project in a life cut short. Inside, she moved through her evening routine with military precision, doors locked, windows secured, the Winchester placed within arm's reach of her bedside. Old habits that Marcus had gently teased her about, never knowing they weren't merely the quirks of a cautious woman, but the survival tactics of someone who had once lived with death as a constant companion. As darkness fell, Eve sat on her porch, nursing a glass of bourbon. The liquor burned pleasantly, a momentary respite from the heat still radiating from the earth. Crickets chirped in the scrubland, their chorus occasionally interrupted by a coyote's distant howl. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did in these quiet moments, to a life she'd left behind, to the woman she'd once been, a woman known as Desert Rose, whose name had been whispered with both fear and respect along the border. A woman who had run the most efficient smuggling operation the Southwest had ever seen. A woman who had died, or so the world believed, 20 years ago. Eve drained her glass, pushing away the memories. That life was over, buried beneath 2 decades of quiet ranching, with a good man who never knew his wife's real history. Or at least that's what she had believed, until tonight. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn. 3 riders approaching from the east. Eve spotted them through her kitchen window as she prepared her morning coffee. Her spine stiffened, hand automatically reaching for the Winchester propped against the counter. She watched them approach, calculating distances and angles out of habit. 3 men riding with the casual confidence of those who feared no law. Their horses moved at an unhurried pace, conserving energy in the already mounting heat. Eve positioned herself on the porch, rifle held casually but visibly. The lead rider pulled up 20 yards from her house, dust billowing around his paint horse. He was a tall man with a cruel set to his mouth, partially hidden beneath a sandy mustache. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. "Morning, ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Fine day we're having." Eve stood impassive, her weathered face betraying nothing. "State your business. Mr. Sun's getting high, and I've got chores to finish." The man smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Name's Reed Jackson." "Reed. My associates and I are passing through collecting provisions for our journey north." "Yon town's 15 miles west," Eve replied evenly. "General store should have what you need." One of the other riders, a heavy-set man with a face mottled by old smallpox scars, spat into the dirt. "We ain't looking for no general store goods, woman." Reed shot him a warning glance before turning back to Eve with a practiced smile. "What my friend means to say is that we're in need of a good horse for our travels. That Appaloosa of yours would serve nicely. We're prepared to compensate you." "Of course." Eve's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her rifle. "Horse isn't for sale at any price. He's my livelihood. 500 is fair." Reed continued as if she hadn't spoken. "More than fair, considering the drought's got everyone selling stock they can't feed. As I said, he's not for sale. Now I'll thank you for moving along." The atmosphere shifted subtle as a snake preparing to strike. Reed's friendly demeanor hardened his eyes cold as a winter in the high desert. "Maybe I'm not making myself clear. Mrs. Morgan." Eve supplied, her voice steady as stone. "Eve Morgan. Mrs. Morgan. My associates and I will be taking that horse. The only choice before you is whether you accept payment and live to buy another when times improve, or—" He let the threat hang in the air between them. The old Eve Rose of the borderlands would have already put a bullet through Reed's eye for such insolence. But 20 years of civilization had taught her restraint, if not submission. 3 men against 1 woman for a single horse. She observed, her tone deceptively mild. "Your mothers must be mighty proud." The smallpox-scarred man laughed harshly. "Hear that, boys? The widow's got sand." A younger rider, barely out of his teens with a patchy attempt at a beard, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Reed, maybe we should move on. Plenty of unguarded herds north of here." "Quiet, Perkins," Reed snapped before turning his attention back to Eve. "Last chance, Mrs. Morgan, 500 for the horse, and we'll leave you in peace." Eve met his gaze unflinchingly. "You're not taking Shadow. Not for 500, not for 5,000. Reed sighed as if genuinely disappointed. "Have it your way." He nodded to his men. "Myers, Perkins, secure the animal." Eve raised her rifle. "Take 1 step toward my barn and I'll put you in the ground." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Reed laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You really think you can take all 3 of us, Mrs. Morgan? Be reasonable." "Don't need to take all 3, Eve replied calmly. "Just you, Mr. Reed. Rest of these boys strike me as followers, not leaders. Without you, they'll scatter like quail." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the lack of fear, made Reed study her more carefully. For 20 years, Eve had worked to bury Desert Rose beneath layers of respectability and routine. But in moments of danger, something of the old predator still showed in her eyes. Whatever Reed saw made him hesitate, but only briefly. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down before his men. With deliberate slowness, he drew his revolver. "Last warning, widow, lower that scattergun." The crack of Eve's rifle split the morning air. Reed's hat flew from his head, a neat hole punched through its crown. His horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. "That was your last warning," Eve stated flatly. "Next one goes through your skull." The young rider Perkins had drawn his pistol reflexively, but looked more terrified than threatening. The others froze, reassessing the situation. "She's bluffing," hissed the smallpox-scarred man Myers. "She can't reload that rifle before we cut her down." What he couldn't see from his position was the Colt 45 partially hidden by Eve's skirt, ready for her right hand the moment the rifle served its purpose. Reed, however, sensed the shifting odds. He'd expected easy prey, and found a scorpion instead. "We'll be moving on, Mrs. Morgan," he finally said, his face contorted with rage. "But these parts can be dangerous for a woman alone. Accidents happen, fires start. Would be a shame if you're still on my property in 10 seconds, Mr. Reed, the buzzards will be picking your bones clean by morning." Eve's voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to giving life or death commands. 1. Reed's face darkened with fury. 2. "You've made a mistake today, widow," he spat. 3. "Let's go, boys," Reed finally ordered, wheeling his horse around. Eve continued counting steadily as they rode away, her rifle trained on Reed's back until they disappeared over the rise. Only when the dust cloud had faded did she lower the weapon, her hands betraying the slightest tremor. not from fear but from the effort of restraint. 20 years ago, she would have killed Reed without hesitation and would have hunted down his men one by one through the borderlands. 20 years of trying to be someone else, someone better, had changed her. But perhaps not as much as she'd believed. Eve checked on Shadow, stroking the horse's soft muzzle. "They'll be back," she murmured. "And not just for you." In the relentless sun, she secured the barn and returned to her cabin. From beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, she retrieved a battered tin box. Inside lay mementos of another life: a silver-plated revolver with elaborate engravings, newspaper clippings in Spanish detailing the exploits of a notorious smuggling gang, and a faded photograph of a much younger Eve surrounded by hard-eyed men and women, her expression cold and commanding. Eve ran her fingers over the image. She had been 26 then, at the height of her power, when the name Desert Rose sent chills through the borderlands before Marcus, before redemption, before she'd buried that life beneath the quiet existence of Eve Morgan, respectable widow. She returned the box to its hiding place but kept the engraved revolver. Some ghosts couldn't stay buried forever. As expected, they came that night, not for Shadow this time, but for retribution. Eve was waiting. The moment she'd seen Reed's eyes, she'd known his type, a man whose pride wouldn't allow a woman to best him, especially publicly before his men. He would return, and he would intend to make an example of her. The moon was a thin sliver offering little illumination as three riders approached from the west, using the natural dip of the land to muffle their approach. Eve watched from the darkened window of her cabin, noting that only three had returned: Reed, Myers, and Perkins. The young one's presence surprised her. He had seemed reluctant earlier. They dismounted 100 yards out, leaving their horses ground-tied in the scrub. Amateurs mistake in the dry brush. Any spooked horse might bolt, leaving them stranded. Eve weighed her options. She could wait in the cabin where the log walls offered some protection, but also limited her mobility and sightlines. Or she could meet them on ground of her choosing. Desert Rose would never have hidden behind walls. She slipped out the back door, moving silently across the packed earth of her yard to the shadows of the barn. 20 years of honest living might have softened her body, but the drought-hardened terrain of the Arizona borderlands had kept her tough. Her footfalls made less noise than a stalking cougar as she circled wide, positioning herself behind the approaching men. "Burn it all," Reed was saying in a harsh whisper. "The barn first, then the house. Let her try to run, and we'll put her down like the she-wolf she thinks she is." Myers chuckled, the moonlight catching the pockmarks on his face, making them appear deeper, more sinister. "Shame to waste such an opportunity, boss. Woman like that, living alone all this time, might be worth having some fun before—" "Shut your mouth, Myers," Reed cut him off. "We're here for justice, not your perverted amusements." Justice? Eve nearly laughed at the irony. Men like Reed always clothed their wounded pride in nobler terms. She waited until they separated, Reed heading for the cabin while the others moved toward the barn with oil lanterns. The moment they were sufficiently distant from each other, she made her move. Perkins heard her a second too late. By the time he turned, Eve had already pressed the muzzle of her revolver against the base of his skull. "Drop the lantern," she whispered gently. He hesitated, and she pressed harder. "Drop it or join your ancestors." The lantern settled softly onto the dirt. Eve relieved him of his gun with practiced efficiency. "Walk to the water trough, hands where I can see them." Once there, she brought the butt of her revolver down on the base of his skull, hard enough to render him unconscious, but measured to avoid killing him. Desert Rose would have slit his throat without hesitation. But Eve Morgan had made promises to Marcus, to herself, to whatever god might still be listening. On down, two remaining Myers. The smallpox-scarred man was approaching the barn from the opposite side, lantern swinging carelessly in his hand. Eve tracked his movements, calculating the right moment to intercept. A floorboard creaked in the cabin. Reed was already inside. Eve made a split-second decision. The barn and Shadow could be rebuilt. Her own life, once taken, was gone forever. She changed course, moving swiftly and silently toward her home. Through the window, she could make out Reed's silhouette as he moved through her darkened living room, pistol drawn, searching for her. She considered shooting him through the glass, but dismissed the thought. Too easy for him to hear the approach, too hard to ensure a kill shot through the distorting pane. Instead, she circled to the back door she'd left slightly ajar. Reed was now in her bedroom, rifling through her possessions, likely seeking valuables to steal after he'd finished his justice. Eve waited still as death until he emerged from the bedroom. Then she stepped into the doorway, her revolver leveled at his chest. "Looking for me, Mr. Reed." He froze, then slowly raised his hands, his own pistol still clutched in his right. "Mrs. Morgan, seems we both misjudged the situation. Put the gun down now." "Oh, let's be reasonable." "There's nothing reasonable about men who threaten a widow and plan to burn her home," Eve replied, her voice as hard as the Arizona bedrock. "Put the gun down." Reed's eyes darted past her, and a slow smile spread across his face. "I don't think I will." Too late. Eve sensed movement behind her. Something heavy struck her shoulder. Not a bullet, but the solid weight of a gun barrel. She staggered forward, maintaining her grip on her weapon, but momentarily disoriented. Myers stood in the doorway, his damaged face twisted in triumph. "Got her, boss." Eve recovered quickly, decades of survival instinct surging to the fore. She dropped to one knee, bringing her revolver up, but Reed was already advancing his own weapon, now aimed squarely at her face. "That was quite a performance earlier today, Mrs. Morgan," he said with genuine appreciation in his voice. "You had me fooled, but no lone woman gets the better of Jackson Reed twice." Eve's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles, assessing threats. Two armed men, both with guns drawn, both with clear shots. Marcus would understand if she broke her vow tonight. Sometimes survival requires blood. "You know," Reed continued conversationally, "there's something familiar about you. The way you handle yourself, the way you move." He studied her face in the dim light filtering through the windows. "What did you say your name was again?" "Eve Morgan," she answered, watching for any distraction, any opening. "Morgan?" he repeated thoughtfully. "Married to that rancher who died last winter. Marcus Morgan." Eve's silence was confirmation enough. "Funny thing," Reed mused. "Knew Marcus Morgan years back. DEA agent disappeared during a mission south of the border, tracking a smuggling operation. Everyone thought he was dead until he resurfaced years later, retired to a quiet life of ranching." The implications hung in the air between them. If Reed knew Marcus had been DEA, he might well know other details, including who Marcus had been hunting when he disappeared. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Reed?" Eve asked, playing for time as she assessed her dwindling options. "I'm suggesting, Mrs. Morgan, that perhaps your husband brought back more than just himself from Mexico." Reed's smile widened. "I've heard stories about a woman down there they called Desert Rose. Ran the most efficient smuggling operation the borderlands had ever seen. Dozens of men under her command. Millions in goods moved north. DEA, Border Patrol, Federals all failed to catch her." Eve kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. No one in Cochise County knew that history. She and Marcus had been careful, starting fresh, where no one knew their past. "Interesting story," she replied evenly. "What happened to this Desert Rose?" "Vanished," Reed said. "About the same time Agent Morgan reappeared." He studied her face intently. "Some say he killed her. Others say," he paused, "others say she was clever enough to realize the game was changing, that the frontier was closing, that perhaps she'd made enough money to disappear. Start fresh." Myers shifted impatiently. "What's this got to do with anything, boss? Let's just finish her and take the horse." "Patience, Myers," Reed chided, never taking his eyes off Eve. "I'm just trying to understand who exactly we're dealing with." His smile turned predatory. "Because if my suspicions are correct, we may have stumbled onto something far more valuable than an Appaloosa horse." Eve remained silent, calculating. The revelation that Reed might know or suspect her true identity changed everything. This was no longer about a stolen horse or wounded pride. If word spread about who she had been, everything she and Marcus had built would crumble. There were still bounties on Desert Rose's head in 3 states and 2 countries. More importantly, there were old enemies who would cross oceans to find her if they knew she was alive. "You've got quite an imagination, Mr. Reed," she finally said. "But I'm just a widow trying to survive." "We'll see," Reed gestured with his pistol. "On your feet, we're going to have a longer conversation somewhere more private. Then you'll tell me exactly who you are and where you've hidden your money. Desert Rose wouldn't have walked away empty-handed. As Eve slowly rose, a sound outside caught their attention, the distinctive pump of a shotgun being racked. "That's far enough, gentlemen." A new voice, authoritative and calm, came from beyond the open door. "Lower your weapons and step away from Mrs. Morgan." Sheriff Alvarez stood silhouetted in the doorway, the twin barrels of his shotgun unwavering. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his dark eyes were hard as obsidian. Reed's face twisted in fury and surprise. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff. Private dispute. Breaking into a widow's home in the dead of night seems mighty public to me." Alvarez's mustache twitched slightly, the only indication of emotion. "Weapons down now." "Nina." For a tense moment, Eve thought Reed might risk it, but survival instinct won out. He slowly lowered his pistol. Myers, however, was slower to comply. His eyes darted between the sheriff and Eve, the lantern light catching the pockmarks on his face, making them appear almost demonic in the shifting shadows. "Myers," Reed warned, reading his companion's intent. "Don't." Too late. Myers swung his weapon toward Alvarez. Two shots rang out simultaneously, the sheriff's shotgun and Eve's revolver. Myers crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Reed dropped his own weapon entirely, hands raised high. "Didn't have to end this way," Alvarez said grimly, keeping his shotgun trained on Reed. "Mrs. Morgan, are you all right?" Eve nodded, lowering her revolver. "I am now sheriff. Thank you for your timely arrival." "Thank your horse," Alvarez replied with the ghost of a smile. "Spotted him wandering loose near the road. Figured something must be wrong for you to leave your gate open." Shadow in the commotion, the horse must have pushed through the unlatched barn door. Eve's eyes stung unexpectedly. The very animal Reed had come to steal had inadvertently saved her. As Alvarez secured Reed with handcuffs, the outlaw's eyes remained fixed on Eve, calculation and suspicion evident in his gaze. "This isn't over," he murmured as the sheriff led him past her. "I know who you are, and once word spreads, that's enough out of you." Alvarez cut him off, giving him a none-too-gentle shove toward the door. Eve watched them go, Reed's threat echoing in her mind. After the sheriff departed with his prisoner and Myers's body, she stood alone in her cabin, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving her drained. She returned to the bedroom and once again retrieved the tin box from beneath the floorboards. The revolver inside gleamed in the lantern light, its silver engravings telling a story few would believe, the story of a woman who had ruled the borderlands with cunning and iron will. Desert Rose had been many things: ruthless, calculating, feared, but never naive. Reed was right about one thing: this wasn't over. Once word spread of his suspicions, others would come: lawmen seeking old bounties, former rivals seeking revenge, treasure hunters seeking the fortune. Desert Rose was rumored to have hidden the peaceful life she had built with Marcus, the quiet existence she had maintained after his death, all of it balanced now on the fragile thread of a secret 2 decades old. Eve closed the box but didn't return it to its hiding place. Instead, she began gathering essentials: food, ammunition, clothing. By dawn, she would need to be gone, at least temporarily. She needed information, needed to know how much Reed actually knew and who he might have already told. Most of all, she needed to contact the only people who might still be loyal to Desert Rose after all these years. As she worked, Eve's movements became more fluid, more purposeful. The careful facade of Eve Morgan, respectable widow, gradually fell away, revealing glimpses of the woman she had once been. The woman who had commanded dozens of loyal smugglers, outsmarted the finest trackers of 2 nations, and built an empire in the lawless borderlands. Desert Rose was awakening. And God help anyone who threatened what was hers. The dawn painted the horizon in shades of crimson and gold as Eve Morgan rode away from the only home she'd known for 20 years. Shadow plodded steadily behind her, tethered to Eve's aging mare. She hadn't bothered trying to sell the ranch or secure her few possessions. Some things mattered more than others when your past came hunting. Sheriff Alvarez had locked up Jackson Reed on charges of breaking and entering, attempted murder, and conspiracy, enough to hold him for at least a few days. But iron bars wouldn't contain the suspicions Reed had voiced. Words had a way of slipping through, finding ears hungry for gossip or Opportunity, Desert Rose had a $10,000 bounty on her head in Texas alone, dead or alive. As the sun climbed higher, Eve turned her mare south toward Coyote Creek, a nondescript waterway that marked the unofficial boundary between civilization and the true wilderness of the borderlands. She knew this route by heart, though she hadn't traveled it in decades. Some paths remain etched in memory no matter how one tries to forget. By midday, she reached a weathered line shack nestled in a stand of cottonwoods. The structure seemed abandoned, its roof partially collapsed windows, long since shattered by storms or vandals. Eve dismounted, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. Another reminder that she was no longer the young woman who had once ridden for days without rest. She secured the animals and approached the cabin cautiously, hand resting on her revolver. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light penetrating the damaged roof. The cabin appeared empty, except for a broken table and the remnants of a cast-iron stove. Eve moved to the back wall, counting boards from the corner. When she reached the seventh plank, she knelt and pressed firmly on its lower edge. The board pivoted smoothly, revealing a hidden compartment. "At least some things remain dependable," she murmured, reaching inside. Her fingers found a small oilskin package. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a tarnished silver medallion on a leather cord, its surface etched with an intricate rose design. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper, the creases so deep they had nearly split the material. Eve studied the medallion, memories flooding back. She had commissioned one for each of her top lieutenants, a symbol of belonging, of loyalty, of family when the previous boss fell to DEA bullets. "Never thought I'd wear this again," she said to the empty room, slipping the cord around her neck and tucking the medallion beneath her shirt. She unfolded the paper, a hand-drawn map marked with locations only she and her inner circle would recognize, landmarks that wouldn't appear on any official chart, meeting points established long ago for emergencies such as this. The nearest was less than a day's ride away, a natural rock formation locals called the Devil's Anvil. Whether anyone would still honor the old protocols after 20 years remained to be seen. But Eve had few alternatives. If word of Desert Rose's resurrection was spreading, she needed intelligence, resources, and possibly protection, none of which Eve Morgan, respectable widow, could access. But Desert Rose could. She replaced the loose board and left the cabin, continuing south. As she rode, Eve's posture gradually changed her back. Straightening chin, lifting her eyes, constantly scanning the horizon, noting details most would miss. Disturbed brush, suggesting recent passage. The flight patterns of birds indicating whether other riders might be nearby. These weren't conscious actions. They were the ingrained habits of someone who had survived in a world where inattention meant death. By late afternoon, she spotted the distinctive rock formation rising from the dusty landscape, a natural anvil indeed, with a tall spire resembling a blacksmith's tool and flat stones forming a seat large enough for several men. Eve approached cautiously, tethering her horse in shadow in a sheltered gully before climbing a ridge that offered a clear view of the formation. For an hour she watched, ensuring no ambush awaited. Then, taking the silver medallion from beneath her shirt, she positioned herself where the setting sun would catch the metal, sending brief flashes of light visible for miles. An old signal, one her people would recognize. If any still lived, if any still watched, if any still considered themselves hers. As darkness settled over the land, Eve made a small sheltered camp in the gully, positioning herself to see anyone approaching while remaining hidden. She allowed herself only the briefest of fires to heat coffee, then extinguished it completely. The night was mild enough to manage without its warmth or comfort. Sleep came in fragments, her body remembering how to rest while remaining alert to danger. Near midnight, she woke fully, hand already on her revolver, senses straining to identify what had disturbed her. A soft whistle carried through the darkness. 3 notes rising in pitch, then 2 descending. A nightbird's call, but no natural bird would produce that precise pattern. Eve remained motionless, waiting. The signal came again, closer now. She replied with a single low whistle, the response only Desert Rose would know. Minutes later, a shadow detached itself from the greater darkness. A man moved with careful deliberation down the slope toward her position, his silhouette familiar despite the passing years. "Never thought I'd see that signal again," he said, his voice carrying the rough texture of desert winds and too much whiskey. Figured you to be dead all these years. Rosie? Hello, Frank. Her voice betrayed no emotion, though seeing him stirred conflicting feelings. Gratitude that someone had answered her call. Wariness about his current allegiances. Frank Wolcott had been her second in command, her most trusted lieutenant. A man who had killed for her, stolen for her, would have died for her until she disappeared, leaving him and the others to fend for themselves when the operation crumbled without her guidance. He crouched several yards away, still cautious. In the faint moonlight, she could make out the changes 20 years had wrought, gray streaking his once black hair, deep lines etched around his eyes, a scar running from his right temple to his jaw that hadn't been there before. Need to see it, he said flatly. Eve reached slowly into her shirt and withdrew the medallion, letting it catch what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Frank nodded once, then reached into his own collar, producing an identical talisman. Still carry it, he said. Some habits die hard. Some loyalties too, it seems. A bark of laughter escaped him. Loyalty, is that what you call it after all this time? He shook his head. I'm here out of curiosity, Rosie. Nothing more. Fair enough. She gestured to the space beside her. Join me anyway, for old time's sake. After a moment's hesitation, Frank settled himself cross-legged on the ground, maintaining a careful distance. 20 years, Rosie. Not a word. Most figured the DEA finally got you. Others thought you'd taken the money and run to California or maybe back east. It's a long story. I've got time. Eve studied him in the darkness, weighing how much to reveal trust had to be earned anew. Too much had happened, too many years had passed. Marcus Morgan. She began watching for his reaction. DEA agent. Frank's face hardened instantly. The one who infiltrated us claimed to be a border patrol officer with a gambling problem. Compared to the same, Eve kept her voice neutral. He caught me. Eve admitted, had me dead to rights, could have collected the bounty, made deputy director on the reward alone, but he didn't. He made a different choice. Frank waited silent for her to continue. Offered me a deal. Walk away from the operation, from the life, start fresh someplace far from the border. In exchange, he'd report me dead, killed in a shootout. No one would come looking. And you agreed, disbelief colored Frank's voice. Just like that, abandoned everything you built. Everyone who depended on you. The accusation stung, though she'd anticipated it. You all had your shares, enough to start new lives if you chose. Money wasn't the point. Rosie, we were a family. You were our... He seemed to search for the right word, mother wolf. Eve suggested, a hint of irony in her tone. Leader, Frank corrected firmly. The only one many of us ever truly respected. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past settling between them. Why did you really agree to his deal? Frank finally asked. The Rosie I knew would have put a bullet in that DEA man and disappeared across the border. Eve considered the question, one she'd asked herself many times over the years. I was tired, she admitted. Tired of running, tired of violence. The operation was growing too large, attracting too much attention. The frontier was changing. Law was coming, whether we liked it or not. So you surrendered. I survived. She countered, adapted, found a different life. Frank made a non-committal sound. And the agent Morgan. What happened to him in this new life of yours? I married him. Eve delivered the statement plainly, watching Frank's reaction. His surprise was evident, even in the darkness. You married the man sent to hunt you down, Stockholm Syndrome. Rosie, she laughed softly. Nothing so dramatic. We traveled together after leaving the border weeks on the trail, just the two of us, came to an understanding. He saw more in me than just Desert Rose. I saw more in him than just a DEA agent. Touching, Frank commented, sarcasm evident. And now he's dead, Eve replied flatly. Cancer took him last winter. Ornarum. Frank fell silent, perhaps recognizing genuine grief in her voice. When he spoke again, his tone was marginally softer. So why the signal, Rosie? Why now, after all this time? A man named Jackson Reed and his gang tried to steal my horse yesterday. Frank's eyebrows rose. You signaled your old lieutenants because someone tried to rustle a single horse. Times have changed indeed. It's not about the horse. Eve leaned forward slightly. Reed recognized me, or suspects at least. Knew things about Desert Rose, about Marcus's DEA work, said once word spreads. Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes. Bounty hunters, lawmen, old enemies. Eve nodded. I need information. Need to know who else might remember, who might care after all this time. Need to know if I should run or stand and fight. What makes you think I'd help you after you abandoned us? Because you answered the signal, she replied simply, because you kept the medallion. Because whatever happened 20 years ago, we were family once. He looked away, his profile harsh in the faint moonlight. Most are gone now. Miguel died in a shootout with the DEA 5 years after you left. Carlos drank himself to death in El Paso. Diane married a banker in Phoenix, has grandchildren now. The names brought faces to Eve's mind. People who had ridden with her, trusted her, followed her into danger countless times. The knowledge of their fates, particularly those who had died, settled like stones in her chest. And you, she asked quietly. Frank's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. Went straight, mostly got a small bar in Tucson. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. No one bothers me. I don't bother them. He paused. Still keep an ear to the ground, though. Old habits. And what are those ears telling you now about Reed, Jackson Reed? Frank mused, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. Name's familiar. Part of the Cortez outfit, I believe, hired guns. Mostly, though, they dabble in smuggling when opportunities arise. Would he know about Desert Rose? The details he mentioned? Possibly those stories never quite died out. Became something of a legend in these parts. The woman who outfoxed the DEA and federales for years, who built the most efficient operation the border ever saw. Frank glanced at her. Some still speculate about what happened to all that money. Eve frowned. What money? The fortune Desert Rose supposedly hid away millions in cash and goods payment for all those shipments moved north. His eyes narrowed. You're saying there wasn't a hidden cache somewhere? We reinvested most profits into the operation. Eve replied carefully. Better weapons, faster horses, reliable information. The rest was distributed among the team. She paused. I didn't keep a hidden fortune. Frank studied her face, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. If you say so, Rosie. But that's not what the stories claim. And if Reed believes those stories, he'll come looking for more than just a horse. And he won't be alone, Eve finished grimly. Frank shifted, wincing slightly as he straightened a stiff leg. If word spreads that Desert Rose is alive, living as a widow in Cochise County, well, there are still those with scores to settle, ranchers who lost stock to us, lawmen who built careers chasing your ghost. What about the old team? Besides those you mentioned, any still around who might help or harm? Frank considered this. Johnny's a sheriff now, if you can believe it. Down in Pima County, turned his back on the old life, completely wouldn't help you, but probably wouldn't hunt you either, as long as you stayed clear of his jurisdiction. And Diego. She held her breath slightly, asking about the man who had been her closest confidant before Franca's shadow crossed Frank's face. Best not seek him out, Rosie. Why, what happened to him? He took your disappearance hardest of all, spent years looking for you. Convinced you'd been betrayed, killed. Frank trailed off. Let's just say he found other loyalties, dangerous ones. Eve absorbed this information, trying to picture the quiet, steady man who had been one of her most reliable lieutenants, transformed into someone Frank deemed dangerous. Meaning, runs with the Escobar cartel now. They control most trafficking from Sonora to Chihuahua, brutal outfit. No code, not like we had. Frank's expression darkened. Diego's their enforcer, has a reputation that would make even the old Desert Rose think twice. The news disturbed Eve more than she cared to admit. Diego had been gentle once, despite his size and strength. A man who preferred talking to fighting, who treated the horses with extraordinary care, who had once risked his life to save a child, caught in the crossfire during a territorial dispute. Hard to imagine, she murmured. People change, Rosie. 20 years is a long time. Indeed it was. Looking at Frank, her once fiercely loyal, second-in-command, now regarding her with guarded wariness, drove that point home powerfully. What about you, she asked directly. Where do you stand in all this? If word gets out about me? Frank took his time answering. I don't hunt former friends, he said finally. But I don't put my neck on the line for those who abandoned me either. Fair enough, Eve thought, more than she deserved. Perhaps I need somewhere to regroup. She said somewhere safe just for a few days. Time to decide my next move. For a long moment, Frank didn't respond. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation mingled with something like faded affection. Got a hunting cabin on the eastern slope of the Dragoons. Hasn't been used in years. Not comfortable, but it's solid. Stocked with some basic provisions. It was more than Eve had dared hope for. Thank you. Don't make me regret it, he replied gruffly. And don't stay more than a week beyond that. You're on your own. Understood. Frank rose stiffly, brushing dust from his trousers. I'll ask around. Carefully see what whispers might be circulating about Desert Rose or Eve Morgan. He gave her an appraising look. For now, though, you might consider changing your appearance. That red hair of yours is too distinctive, even with the gray coming in. Eve touched her braid self-consciously. Once her most striking feature, her copper-red hair had faded over the years, streaked with silver at the temples. Still, Frank was right. Anyone with a description of Desert Rose would look for a red-haired woman. I'll handle it, she promised. He nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. Was it worth it, Rosie walking away, the quiet life? The question caught her off guard with its earnestness. Eve considered it seriously before answering. It was different, peaceful in its way. Marcus was a good man. A faint smile touched her lips. Though I suspect he always slept with one eye open, even after all those years. Smart man. Yes, he understood what I was, accepted it, even while hoping I'd become something else. Her expression sobered. For a long time I thought I had become someone new. Eve Morgan, respectable rancher's wife. But now, Frank prompted. Now Desert Rose is awake again. Eve admitted quietly. Perhaps she never truly slept. Frank suggested Eve didn't respond, but the truth of his words settled in her chest like a stone. For 20 years she had believed herself reformed, redeemed by Marcus's love and her own determination to leave the past behind. But how quickly she had reached for her weapons when threatened. How easily the old instincts had resurged. Perhaps the woman she had been calculating, dangerous, ruthless when necessary, had merely been dormant, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. Frank gave her directions to the hunting cabin, detailed enough that she could find it even in unfamiliar territory. Before departing, he hesitated once more. One last thing. If you're determined to handle this situation yourself, there's someone you should talk to in Tucson. Woman named Diane Reynolds runs the Desert Diamond Bank. Who is she? Someone with her ear to the ground. Someone who remembers Desert Rose with something like respect. Cherie infâme. A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. Someone who might still have some of that legendary fortune everyone thinks you hid away. With that cryptic statement, Frank faded into the darkness, leaving Eve with more questions than answers, but also with something she hadn't expected to find: a tenuous connection to her former life, and perhaps the beginnings of a path forward. As dawn approached, Eve broke camp and headed northwest, following Frank's directions. Her mind worked through everything she'd learned, cataloging threats, assessing options. Eve Morgan might have fled danger, sought protection from the law, despite the questions that would raise. But Desert Rose had never run from a fight, had never allowed threats to herself or those under her protection to go unanswered. The medallion rested against her skin, its weight familiar and strange, simultaneously a symbol of who she had been, of power and respect, earned through cunning and controlled violence, of loyalty, commanded and given. 20 years ago, she had set that identity aside, willingly believing it necessary for survival. Now survival might demand its return. As the sun rose, fully painting the landscape in stark light and shadow, Eve Morgan rode toward an uncertain future, the ghost of Desert Rose rising within her with each passing mile. Whether that resurrection would prove her salvation or her destruction remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: Jackson Reed and his men had unknowingly awakened something far more dangerous than a simple widow defending her homestead. They had roused a legend. And legends, Eve knew from bitter experience, had teeth. Frank's hunting cabin clung to the edge of a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. its weathered boards bleached silver gray by decades of harsh sun. To most eyes, it would appear abandoned, just another forgotten remnant of the frontier's constant push westward. For Eve, it was perfect defensible, with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes. She spent the first day securing the perimeter, establishing habits that had kept her alive during her years as Desert Rose tripwires, with attached tin cans near likely approach paths, a carefully positioned mirror to catch movement from the canyon below shadow, and her mare stabled in a natural limestone hollow behind the cabin, hidden from casual observation. Only when she was satisfied with the security measures did Eve allow herself to truly assess her situation. Food and water were sufficient for a week, just as Frank had promised. Her ammunition, however, was limited: 20 rounds for the revolver, 16 for the rifle. If serious trouble found her, it wouldn't be enough. On the second morning, Eve stood before a cracked mirror inside the shack, studying her reflection critically. Frank had been right about her hair, too distinctive, too memorable. She unwound her braid, letting the copper and silver tresses fall past her shoulders. "Been a long time since anyone but Marcus saw this," she murmured to the empty room. From her saddlebags, she removed a pair of shears and a small bottle of walnut stain she'd purchased years ago for treating leather. With methodical precision, she cut her hair to just below her ears, the snipping sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Then she applied the stain, working it through, until her trademark red was transformed to a nondescript brown. The woman who stared back from the mirror was a stranger, harder, older, her features more pronounced without the softening frame of long hair. She looked like what she was, a survivor worn by years and loss, but unbroken. "Hello, Rose," she whispered to her reflection. "Welcome back." By midday, Eve had changed into the spare clothes Frank had left, men's attire practical for riding and fighting. The transformation was nearly complete. Eve Morgan, respectable widow, had vanished. In her place stood someone between two identities, not fully the legendary Desert Rose, but certainly no longer the woman who had quietly tended a small ranch for 20 years. As she slipped Marcus's pocket watch into her vest, her fingers brushed against a folded paper, the map Frank had drawn to Tucson, with the Desert Diamond Bank clearly marked beneath it in Frank's cramped handwriting. "Ask for Diane. Tell her the Rose sent you. Trust no one else." Tucson was a day's hard ride away. Going there meant leaving the relative safety of the hunting cabin, exposing herself to potential recognition. Yet remaining in hiding solved nothing. If Reed had already spread word about his suspicions, bounty hunters would be combing the region soon enough. Knowledge was survival, always had been. Desert Rose's power had come not just from her willingness to use force, but from her network of information, knowing which ranches were vulnerable, which lawmen could be bribed, which trails were watched. Without that network, she was just one aging woman with a gun and dwindling ammunition. Decision made, Eve packed only the essentials: food, water, weapons, and a small bundle of gold coins she kept hidden in the lining of her saddlebag. 20 years of emergency money, a habit Marcus had never managed to break her, of "always have a way out," she murmured, echoing the mantra that had guided her earlier life. She departed at dusk, when the harsh sunlight had softened to golden hues that played tricks on the eye. Better to travel at night, when her silhouette would be harder to distinguish, when the desert cooled enough for the horses to maintain a steady pace without exhaustion. As she rode, Eve mentally cataloged what she knew and what she needed to learn. Reed was imprisoned for now, but jails in frontier towns were notoriously porous. His gang, at least those who hadn't been at her ranch that night, would still be at large. And if he'd already shared his suspicions about her identity, the DEA maintained a standing bounty on Desert Rose, $10,000, enough to tempt even honest men in these hard times. Add to that the rumored fortune she'd supposedly hidden, and Eve faced a perfect storm of motivated hunters. But before she could plan her next move, she needed current information. How widespread were the rumors? Who exactly was coming for her? And perhaps, most importantly, was there anyone left from her old life who might still stand with her? Dawn found Eve in a narrow arroyo 10 miles outside Tucson, where she made a cold camp to rest through the heat of the day. As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the scorching temperatures of late summer, she dozed fitfully, one hand always near her revolver. Her dreams were fragmented memories, Marcus's face lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes as he laughed at something she'd said. The thundering of hooves as her gang drove stolen goods across the Rio Grande under cover of darkness. The weight of her first medallion as someone placed it around her neck, marking her as leader when the previous boss fell to DEA bullets. She woke fully at dusk alert despite the broken sleep. After checking that no one had discovered her hiding place, Eve prepared to enter Tucson. She bound her chest flat beneath the men's shirt, pulled a wide-brimmed hat low over her now darkened hair, and smudged dirt along her jawline to suggest stubble. At a distance, not a perfect disguise, but enough to prevent casual recognition in the dim light of evening. The city had grown since she'd last seen it. Electric lights now illuminating the main street, permanent structures replacing many of the temporary buildings she remembered. Progress marched on even in these remote places. But some things remained unchanged: the wariness with which strangers were observed, the mix of languages floating through the air, the sense that Tucson existed in the space between worlds neither fully American nor Mexican. Eve located the Desert Diamond Bank. Easily enough, a two-story establishment on the city's eastern edge with an attached saloon. Unlike the more raucous venues closer to the center, this place emanated a quiet respectability: no piano player pounding out tinny melodies, no painted women calling from the balcony, just the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. She tethered her horse at a hitching post several buildings away, not wanting to leave the animal directly outside her destination. Old habits always secure alternate escape routes. Then, squaring her shoulders and adopting the loose-limbed gait of a man, she pushed through the saloon's batwing doors. Inside, perhaps a dozen patrons occupied tables scattered around a room illuminated by kerosene lamps and a few electric fixtures. The bar itself was solid mahogany imported at great expense from back east, if Eve was any judge. Passing through Mostar, Diane pushed the whiskey toward her. Looking for work, might know of opportunities for the right sort. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Diane was fishing, trying to determine what kind of stranger had entered her establishment. Eve took a sip of the whiskey, surprisingly good given the remote location, before responding. "Depends on the work, was told to seek you out specifically." Diane's expression remained neutral, but her posture shifted subtly into something more alert, more guarded. "Is that so? And who made such a suggestion?" Eve glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "The Rose sent me." For a moment, Diane didn't respond. Then, very deliberately, she reached beneath her collar and withdrew a silver medallion identical to the one Eve wore, hidden beneath her own shirt. "Been a long time since anyone used that particular introduction," Diane said softly. "Who exactly are you, stranger?" Eve raised her eyes fully to meet Diane's gaze. Recognition flickered across the saloon keeper's face, quickly masked. Without a word, Diane inclined her head toward a door behind the bar. "Tony," she called to a young man serving tables. "Watch things for a spell." Diane led Eve through the door into a small office sparsely furnished with a desk and two chairs. A loaded shotgun hung on the wall within easy reach. Once the door closed behind them, Diane crossed her arms, studying Eve with open suspicion. "If you're who I think you are, you've got nerve showing your face anywhere near the border." Eve removed her hat, revealing her shorn, darkened hair. "Hello, Diane. It's been a long time." Diane Reeves, formerly Diane Reynolds before she apparently reclaimed her maiden name, had been one of Desert Rose's most valuable assets. As the operations financial manager, she had provided crucial information about banking practices and law enforcement, financial investigations, enabling the smuggling operation to launder money efficiently. 20 years, Diane replied flatly. 20 years of silence, and now you appear at my door. Why? Frank suggested I seek you out. Of course he did. Diane's mouth tightened. That man never could fully let go of the past. I've built something here, something legitimate. He's temporarily in custody, but once word spreads about Desert Rose resurfacing, you'll have every bounty hunter from here to St. Louis on your trail. Diane finished grimly. The reward's up to 10,000 now, dead or alive. 10,000? Eve's eyebrows rose. Inflation's been kind to my reputation. This isn't a joke, Diane snapped. Do you have any idea how much damage control we had to do after you vanished? How many of us spent years looking over our shoulders wondering if you turned evidence in exchange for amnesty? The accusation stung. I never betrayed anyone. No. Then where were you when the DEA rounded up Miguel? When they hanged Carlos in front of the courthouse in El Paso? Eve had no answer. Marcus had kept such news from her in those early years, knowing how it would affect her. By the time she learned the fates of her former associates, it had been too late to do anything but mourn privately. I'm sorry, she said finally. Truly. But right now I need to know who might come after me and how quickly I need to protect myself. Diane's expression remained hard, but something in her posture softened slightly. Practical as ever, fine. What exactly did this Reed fellow say? Eve recounted the confrontation at her ranch, including Reed's specific references to Desert Rose and Marcus's DEA work. When she finished, Diane looked troubled. He knows too much for coincidence. Someone's been talking. That's my assessment as well. Question is who knew both sides of that story are dead. Diane crossed to a cabinet, withdrew a bottle of tequila and 2 glasses. She poured generous measures into each before responding. There's an old DEA agent in town, retired, named Fletcher, lost an arm chasing your gang back in '03. Eve remembered him, a tenacious lawman who'd nearly caught them during a crossing near Nogales. He's still alive. Very much so, and still bitter about the one that got away. Diane pushed a glass toward Eve. He drinks here sometimes, tells stories about the famous Desert Rose to anyone who'll listen. Most think they're just tall tales from a one-armed old man, but if someone was specifically researching you, Fletcher would be a natural source, Eve concluded. And from what you've said, this Reed character seems to have done his homework. Eve absorbed this information, piecing together implications. So Reed learns about Desert Rose from Fletcher, somehow connects those stories to Eve Morgan. Why? What prompted him to make that leap? Diane sipped her tequila thoughtfully. That's the question, isn't it? Coincidence seems unlikely. Perhaps someone pointed him in your direction. A chill ran through Eve despite the warm evening. You think I was targeted specifically, not just a random theft attempt? I think, Diane said carefully, that the rumors about your hidden fortune never died out. Some still believe Desert Rose stashed away millions before disappearing. There is no fortune, Eve insisted. Whatever wasn't reinvested in the operation was distributed among the gang. Diane's expressions suggested skepticism. So you've said, but legends have a way of growing over time. The story now claims you hid upwards of $2 million in gold somewhere in the Chiricahua Mountains. $2 million, Eve couldn't help but laugh. Our entire operation never saw that kind of money even at its peak. Truth rarely interferes with a good story. Diane leaned forward. But here's what concerns me. 2 months ago, a man came through town asking questions about Desert Rose. Not Fletcher's usual audience, this was someone educated, methodical. He spoke with the old agent for hours, took notes. Description: tall, well-dressed city man by his speech and manner. Carried himself like a soldier, though he never said as much. The description could fit dozens of men, including Reed himself, but the timing was suggestive. And after that, nothing until 3 weeks ago. Different man, rougher sort, asked similar questions but less refined in his approach. Mentioned something about a widow in Cochise County who matched certain descriptions. Eve's blood ran cold. 3 weeks ago, Diane nodded shortly. After that, I heard rumors about a new operation forming north of here, recruiting experienced men offering good pay. When I made inquiries, she hesitated. The name attached to it was Reed. The pieces were aligning with disturbing clarity. Someone had deliberately researched Desert Rose, made the connection to Eve Morgan, and then targeted her specifically not for her horse, but for information about a non-existent fortune. The attempted theft had likely been meant to pressure her, perhaps even kidnap her. I need names, Eve said firmly. Who else is involved in this operation? How large is it? And most importantly, who sent that first man to research me? Diane's expression turned guarded again. That kind of specific information costs more than old loyalty, Rose. Of course, nothing was ever truly free, especially in the borderlands. Name your price. There's a shipment coming from Mexico, medical supplies primarily, The current border situation makes importing them problematic. Smuggling. Eve translated bluntly. Call it what you will. Diane shrugged unapologetically. The supplies are desperately needed at the hospital in Bisbee. I've already paid for them. All you need to do is ensure they cross safely. The request was reasonable enough, especially by borderland standards. Medical supplies weren't guns or drugs. This was the kind of smuggling that happened daily, necessary because official channels were too slow, too expensive, or too corrupt. When? 3 nights from now, new moon. The crossing point is marked on this map. Diane withdrew a folded paper from her desk drawer. My usual man had an unfortunate encounter with Border Patrol last week, currently enjoying government hospitality in Tucson. Eve took the map, studying the marked location, a reasonable crossing point away from regular patrols but accessible by wagon. And in exchange, everything I know about Reed's operation, including the identity of his financial backer, the man who first came asking questions. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. Plus something more valuable, a name and location you'll want very much. Diego? Eve's head snapped up. You know where he is. I know where he'll be 4 nights from now after your business at the crossing is concluded. Diane's expression softened fractionally. He's not the man you knew, Rose. The years haven't been kind. So Frank said he runs with the Escobar cartel now. That's putting it mildly. He's Escobar's right hand, his enforcer. Diane hesitated. There are stories about what he's done. Brutal stories. Eve absorbed this, trying to reconcile the gentle giant she'd known with the monster Diane described. Nevertheless, she needed to see him. If anyone from the old days might still help her, it would be Diego. Your funeral, Diane muttered, then drained her glass. One more thing you should know. There's already talk in certain circles about Desert Rose's return. Nothing specific yet, but whispers. There's how widespread, contained for now. But if Reed escapes custody or manages to get word out, Diane let the implication hang in the air. Eve nodded grimly. Time isn't on my side. It rarely is in our line of work. Diane stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Rest here tonight. There's a room upstairs that doesn't appear in the books. Tomorrow I'll provide what information I have on Reed's current operation. In exchange, you'll handle my crossing problem. So, it was a fair arrangement, better than Eve had hoped for. Agreed. As Diane led her to a hidden staircase behind the office, Eve found herself wondering what Marcus would think of this turn of events. Her straight-arrow DEA husband had accepted her past, but always encouraged her to keep it firmly behind her. Now here she was making deals with former associates, preparing to facilitate smuggling operations, sliding back into the world she'd left behind as easily as changing clothes. The realization brought no guilt, only a strange sense of homecoming. This was the world she understood, where rules were fluid, but codes of honor were ironclad, where survival depended on wit and will rather than law and order. One last question, Eve said as they reached the hidden room. The medallion, you still wear it after all this time. Why? Diane's hand moved unconsciously to where the silver rose lay beneath her collar. Some loyalties run deeper than disappointment. Some debts can never be fully paid. Her eyes met Eve's directly. You saved my life, once saved my daughter's too. The fact that you abandoned us later doesn't erase that debt. With that, she left Eve alone in the sparse room with its narrow bed and single window overlooking the back alley, a perfect escape route. Eve noted automatically as she secured the door and checked the window's latch. Eve reflected on Diane's words. Loyalties, debts. The complex web of obligations and alliances that had defined her earlier life was still intact, if frayed by time and absence. It was a foundation she could potentially rebuild upon if necessary. Tomorrow would bring more information, more clarity about the threats she faced. For tonight, Eve allowed herself the luxury of true rest, for the first time since Reed's men had appeared at her ranch. Whatever came next, she would face it with a clearer understanding of the forces aligned against her, and perhaps with allies she'd thought lost forever. Desert Rose was awakening fully now, her instincts sharpening with each passing hour. The hunter was becoming the hunted, But that equation could be reversed, had been reversed many times in the blood-soaked history of the borderlands. As sleep claimed, her Eve's last conscious thought was a promise she made to herself. Those who had sought to threaten her would soon learn why Desert Rose's name had once been whispered in fear throughout the territories. Some legends dimmed with time, others only grew more dangerous. Dawn painted Tucson's adobe buildings in shades of amber and gold, as Eve followed Diane through the city's back alleys. They moved efficiently, avoiding the main streets where early risers might take note of strangers. Diane led with the confidence of someone who knew every shadowed corner and hidden passage in the border town. "In here," she murmured, indicating a weathered door set into a high adobe wall. "Fletcher's place," she added, answering Eve's unspoken question. Eve hesitated. "The DEA agent. You're taking me directly to him?" "Former DEA agent," Diane corrected. "And yes, best information comes from primary sources." Before Eve could object, Diane rapped a distinctive pattern on the door. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more. Moments later, it swung inward to reveal a courtyard garden, surprisingly lush, given the harsh desert climate. Beyond stood a modest adobe house, its door open to the morning breeze. In the doorway waited a tall, lean man in his 70s, white hair cropped close to his scalp, empty left sleeve pinned neatly to his shoulder. Despite his age, he stood straight as a cavalry officer, keen eyes taking in Eve's disguise with obvious skepticism. "This your business associate, Diane." His voice carried the distinctive drawl of East Texas, weathered by years but still strong. "Someone with mutual interests," Diane replied carefully, "seeking information about recent visitors to town." Fletcher's gaze remained fixed on Eve, mighty particular disguise for simple business inquiries. Eve met his stare evenly, saying nothing. This man had hunted her for years, had lost his arm in pursuit of her gang. If anyone could see through her altered appearance, it would be him. After a tense moment, Fletcher stepped aside. "Come in, then. Coffee's hot." The interior of Fletcher's home reflected the man's spare orderly with touches of unexpected elegance. A bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes, a chess set carved from mesquite wood, maps of the borderlands covering one wall annotated in precise handwriting. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a small table. As they settled, he poured 3 cups of coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Now, who exactly am I entertaining this fine morning?" Fletcher fixed Eve with an unwavering stare. Diane began to speak, but Fletcher waved her silent with his one hand. "Not asking you. Diane asking our friend in the poor man's disguise." Eve weighed her options carefully. Lying seemed pointless. The old agent's instincts were clearly intact. Yet revealing her identity risked everything. "Someone with questions about Jackson Reed," she finally said, keeping her voice in its lower register. "And the man who came to town researching Desert Rose 2 months back." Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting combination of inquiries." He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim. "Might be more inclined to share what I know, if you'd stop this charade. Insulting both our intelligences." Eve glanced at Diane, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Very well." Eve allowed her voice to return to its natural pitch. "Better." Fletcher leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You know, for 20 years I've had the same dream. Desert Rose sitting across from me just like this. Only difference is in my dreams, I still have my left arm to put a bullet through her eye." The threat hung in the air between them. Eve tensed, ready to move if necessary, but Fletcher merely chuckled, the sound dry as desert sand. "Relax, if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have invited you in for coffee." He shook his head slowly. "Besides, killing legends rarely works out the way you expect. They have a habit of rising again." Eve's surprise must have shown, because Fletcher's chuckle deepened. "Oh yes, I recognized you the moment Diane brought you to my door. Eyes don't change, never could forget those eyes." Sure, he took another sip of coffee. "Eve Morgan, now is it Marcus's widow?" The direct question stunned her. "How did you know about Marcus?" Fletcher shrugged. He was one of mine, best tracker I ever trained. When he disappeared hunting you, then resurfaced years later with a mysterious red-headed wife." His smile held no humor. wasn't hard to piece together. You never reported your suspicions, to whom by then most folks had forgotten Desert Rose. Those who remembered thought her dead. Fletcher's gaze hardened. Besides, Marcus was like a son to me. If he chose to protect you, must have had his reasons. Diane cleared her throat. Perhaps we could focus on the matter at hand. Reed's inquiries. Fletcher nodded. Right, your man. Reed came through about 5 weeks back. Not the first to ask about Desert Rose. Get curiosity seekers occasionally, but definitely the most persistent. What exactly did he want to know? Eve asked. Everything, your methods, your territory, how many rode with you. Fletcher ticked off items on his fingers. Most particularly, he wanted details about your disappearance, whether any money was recovered when your operation collapsed. Just as Diane had suggested, the legendary fortune driving Reed's interest. And what did you tell him? What I tell all the treasure hunters, that Desert Rose was too clever to be caught, too careful to leave a fortune where anyone might stumble across it. Fletcher's one hand dropped to the table. But this fellow was different. Most listened to my stories. Buy me a drink, move on. Reed had documentation. Eve tensed. What kind of documentation? Ledger pages, banking records from as far away as San Francisco property deeds. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. Evidence suggesting someone from your operation invested substantial funds in legitimate businesses after your disappearance. This was unexpected. Eve had always been meticulous about keeping no written records of the gang's finances. That's impossible. We never kept ledgers. These weren't your records, Fletcher clarified. These were banking documents tracking large gold deposits made between 2002 and 2005, corresponding to your most active periods. Eve's mind raced through possibilities. Some of her lieutenants had indeed deposited their shares in banks, but always in small amounts to avoid attention. No one should have had enough to trigger the kind of documentation Fletcher described. Unless Diego, she murmured, remembering her trusted lieutenant who had handled much of the operation's finances. Was there a name associated with these transactions? Fletcher nodded. Daniel Santiago, obvious alias, but the signatures matched on multiple documents. Eve and Diane exchanged glances. Diego's given name had been Daniel. There's more. Fletcher continued. Reed wasn't just asking about historical matters. He wanted to know if anyone from your operation was still active in the region. Specifically mentioned, your lieutenant described him accurately, though never used a name. Diego again? Diane murmured. Indeed. Fletcher reached for a nearby drawer, withdrew a folded newspaper. This might interest you. Arrived on yesterday's stage from Phoenix. The newspaper was open to a small article halfway down the page. Prominent banker murdered, Phoenix, Arizona. Daniel Santiago, founder of Sonoran Trust Bank, was found dead in his office Wednesday morning, the apparent victim of a brutal attack. Mr. Santiago, known for his philanthropic work with orphanages, had recently announced plans to retire after 15 years in banking. Authorities report that the office safe was emptied, with estimated losses exceeding $1.5 million. No suspects have been identified at this time. Eve read the article twice, struggling to reconcile the Daniel Santiago, described respectable banker philanthropist, with the Diego she had known. Yet the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. $1.5 million, she said finally. That would explain the rumors about Desert Rose's fortune. Indeed it would. Fletcher folded the newspaper carefully, especially if someone discovered the connection between Mr. Santiago and your operation. Reed. Eve concluded. Fletcher's expression turned thoughtful. Though Reed struck me as the instrument, not the architect. His questions were too specific, too directed, as if he'd been told exactly what to look for. By whom? Fletcher shrugged. That's the real question, isn't it? Who would have both the resources to track these financial records across decades and the motivation to recover this particular fortune? The man who came before Reed. Diane leaned forward. The educated one I mentioned. Hammond. Fletcher supplied. Edward Hammond presented himself as a historian researching frontier justice. Had the manners of Eastern money, but his hands. Fletcher's eyes narrowed at the memory. His hands were those of a man familiar with violence, calloused in ways books don't cause. The name meant nothing to Eve, but the description added another piece to the puzzle. And Hammond sought the same information as Reed. Similar, but his approach was different, less direct. He circled around the subject of Desert Rose's finances, probing for weaknesses, inconsistencies in the stories. Fletcher tapped the table thoughtfully. Man knew how to interrogate without his subject realizing it. Military intelligence, if I had to guess, is military intelligence. The words triggered a distant memory, a federal agent she'd encountered during a border crossing, a man who had nearly exposed her operation before she eliminated him. He'd had a partner who escaped a younger man with cold eyes and methodical methods. This Hammond, Eve asked carefully, age early 50s, perhaps silver at his temples, carried himself like he'd seen war. That's an accurate description. Fletcher studied her with renewed interest. You know him. I might have encountered someone similar long ago. Eve's jaw tightened. If Hammond was who she suspected, this wasn't about money, it was about revenge. What else did he ask about Hammond? Fletcher considered the question. Wanted to know if Desert Rose had any identifying marks. Scars, tattoos, anything distinctive beyond the red hair mentioned in most accounts. Eve tensed. During her time as Desert Rose, she had indeed carried a distinctive mark, a small tattoo on her right shoulder, the same rose design as her medallion. It had been her pledge to the gang, a symbol that she was bound to them as they were to her. Marcus had been the only outsider who had ever seen it. Did you tell him about the tattoo? She asked quietly. Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly information he hadn't possessed. No, wasn't aware of any such mark. His gaze turned speculative. Interesting that you are, though, Diane intervened smoothly. What else can you tell us about Hammond's inquiries? Fletcher's attention remained fixed on Eve for a moment longer before he responded. Asked if there were any known associates still in the area. Anyone who might have information about where Desert Rose might have gone after disappearing. And you pointed him toward me, Diane concluded, a hint of accusation in her tone. Told him there were rumors about a banker who might have known some of the gang, Fletcher admitted. Didn't name names, but a man like that, he wouldn't have needed much more. Eve processed this information, connecting threads. Hammond researches Desert Rose, possibly seeking revenge for events 2 decades past. He identifies Diego now, Daniel Santiago, as the gang's financial manager, and discovers the banking records. Santiago accumulated substantial wealth that likely derived from the gang's operations. Then Hammond sends Reed to find her to verify her identity and extract information about Diego's money. That would be my assessment. Fletcher agreed when she voiced this theory. Though I suspect they weren't expecting to find Desert Rose herself, more likely hoped to find someone who knew where she had gone. The widow Morgan being Desert Rose. He shook his head. That would have been an unexpected bonus. But how did they make that connection? Diane wondered, from Desert Rose to Eve Morgan. Fletcher's expression turned grave. That I may have inadvertently facilitated. When discussing Marcus's disappearance and subsequent return, I mentioned he'd settled in Cochise County with his wife. He grimaced. Didn't make the explicit connection, but for someone already suspecting Marcus's involvement with Desert Rose's disappearance, it would be a natural line of inquiry. Eve finished feeling a chill despite the morning warmth. Her careful anonymity, maintained for 20 years, had been unraveled by the most tenuous of connections. There's one more piece you should know. Fletcher rose and crossed to his desk. From a drawer, he withdrew a folded telegraph message. This arrived yesterday from a former colleague in Cochise County. Eve took the paper dread building as she read, Fletcher stop Reed. Escaped custody. Stop 2 deputies. Dead stop Morgan Ranch burned to ground. Stop no sign of widow. Stop advise if contact made stop Alvarez. Her home destroyed, the life she'd built with Marcus reduced to ashes. I'm sorry, Fletcher said, genuine regret in his voice. Alvarez is a good man. He'll do what he can to contain the situation. Eve refolded the telegram, struggling to maintain her composure. It was just a place, she said finally. Things can be rebuilt. Perhaps, Fletcher agreed. But this raises the stakes considerably. Reed has now killed lawmen. That makes this a territorial matter, possibly even federal. The manhunt will be substantial. And if they discover Reed's connection to me, then every ranger and marshal from here to the Mississippi will be looking for both of us. Eve concluded grimly. Though for different reasons, the implications were clear. Eve needed to resolve this situation quickly before the full weight of law enforcement descended on the region. Once that happened, her chances of remaining free, let alone recovering any sense of normal life, would vanish entirely. I need to find Diego, she decided, before Hammond and Reed do. Diane nodded. As I mentioned last night, I know where he'll be in 3 days' time after you handle my crossing. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. Involving yourself in smuggling operations, Diane. Medical supplies, Diane responded tartly. For the hospital in Bisbee, hardly a criminal enterprise. In the eyes of the law, crossing the border with undeclared goods is still smuggling. Fletcher turned to Eve. And you're willing to risk this when every lawman in Arizona may soon be looking for you. I need Diane's information. Eve replied simply, the price is reasonable. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Marcus always said you were pragmatic to a fault. He rose across to his map wall and beckoned them over. If you're determined to pursue this course, you should at least be properly informed about the current border situation. The map he indicated showed the U.S.-Mexico border from El Paso to Nogales, with detailed annotations about patrol routes, checkpoint locations, and known smuggling corridors. Eve recognized some from her days running contraband across the border, but many were new to her. Border Patrol has doubled patrols since the recent unrest in Sonora. Fletcher explained tracing routes with his finger. Regular crossings here, here, and here. Military presence increased at established fords and bounty hunters watching the traditional smuggling trails hoping to collect on cartel rewards. Diane frowned at this last piece of information. Is Cooper still operating in the Huachuca Mountains? Fletcher nodded. Him and his whole crew, 6 men well armed with a particular distaste for Mexican smugglers. They patrol this 20-mile stretch. He indicated an area just north of the planned crossing point. We'll need to adjust the route, Diane muttered. Cooper's not one to show mercy even for medical supplies. Eve studied the map, intently memorizing details, assessing risks. The political situation had clearly evolved since her time operating in the region, but the fundamentals remained unchanged. Those with power controlled the crossings, and violence was the currency that maintained that control. What about Hammond? She asked, redirecting the conversation. Any indication of his current whereabouts? Fletcher shook his head. After speaking with me, he departed for Phoenix. That was 7 weeks ago, hasn't returned to Tucson since... Phoenix, Eve repeated thoughtfully, where Diego Daniel Santiago was just murdered. Indeed, Fletcher's expression was grave. I don't believe in coincidences of that magnitude, neither did Eve. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the motivations remained murky. Hammond identifies Diego as the key to Desert Rose's missing fortune, tracks him to Phoenix, discovers his banking empire. Then what confronts him tries to extort information. And where did Reed fit into this equation? A hired gun sent to flush out other members of the gang, or something more? I need to see the scene of Santiago's murder. Eve decided, Phoenix is only a day's hard ride. Diane began, but shook her head firmly. The crossing happens tomorrow night. You agreed to handle it in exchange for my information. And I'll honor that agreement, Eve assured her. But immediately after I'm heading to Phoenix, Fletcher cleared his throat. That may be unwise. Phoenix will be swarming with lawmen investigating the bank robbery. A stranger asking questions about the deceased would attract unwanted attention. He had a point. Eve's disguise might pass casual inspection in Tucson, but Phoenix was a larger, more sophisticated city with a substantial law enforcement presence. Besides, Diane added, Diego won't be in Phoenix. As I told you, I know where he'll be 3 nights from now. Eve's head snapped toward her. Diego is alive. But the newspaper reports of Daniel Santiago's death, a banker, Diane said carefully, a philanthropist, a carefully constructed identity. Clever. Fletcher interjected, understanding dawning on his weathered face. Very clever. Eve processed this revelation. If Diego had faked his death as Daniel Santiago, it suggested he knew Hammond was closing in, had orchestrated his own murder to escape with the money, the fortune everyone believed belonged to Desert Rose. The story gets more complicated by the minute. She murmured, "Life on the border usually does." Fletcher replied philosophically. He returned to the table, sat heavily. "So you assist Diane with her medical supplies, then meet with Diego, the allegedly deceased Daniel Santiago. Then what confront Hammond and Reed him?" Put so bluntly, the plan did sound rather optimistic. "One step at a time," Eve replied. "First, I need to understand exactly what's happening. Diego should have those answers." Fletcher nodded slowly. "Just remember the Diego you knew is gone. The man he's become." He exchanged glances with Diane. "Well, let's just say his reputation rivals that of Desert Rose in her prime, and not for his mercy. I'm aware of the risks." "Yes, are you?" Fletcher leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Because from where I sit, you're placing an awful lot of faith in old loyalties. 20 years is a long time. People change, priorities shift. The code you once lived by." He shook his head. "The borderlands aren't what they were. Rose, neither are the people who inhabit them." The use of her given name, not Desert, Rose, not Mrs. Morgan, caught her attention. There was genuine concern in the old agent's voice, which seemed absurd given their history. This man had hunted her for years, had lost his arm trying to bring her to justice. Yet here he was, offering something close to friendly advice. "Why are you helping me?" she asked directly. "You could have me arrested, collect the bounty yourself." Fletcher's laugh held no humor. "At my age, what would I do with $10,000? Buy a fancier coffin?" He shook his head. "Besides arresting, you wouldn't bring my arm back, wouldn't restore the lives lost during our long chase." "Then why?" "Because Marcus saw something in you worth saving." Fletcher said simply, "I trusted his judgment in all things. See no reason to question it now, even from beyond the grave." The mention of Marcus brought a sharp pang of grief, still fresh. Despite the months since his passing, Eve pushed it aside, focusing on the practical matters at hand. "I'll take your warnings under advisement," she told Fletcher. "But I'm seeing this through Hammond and Reed came after me, burned my home. I need to understand why and ensure they can't threaten me again." Fletcher nodded, resignation clear in his expression. "Then I won't waste breath trying to dissuade you, but I will offer one piece of equipment that might prove useful." He rose, crossed to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, and withdrew a holstered Colt revolver with distinctive pearl grips. "Marcus's service weapon. He left it with me before heading south to find you all those years ago. Seems fitting it should return to his widow now." Eve accepted the weapon with mixed emotions. Marcus had rarely spoken of. His DEA days had preferred farming tools to firearms in their life together. But he had occasionally mentioned his former mentor, the man who had taught him everything about tracking, about the harsh justice of the frontier. "Thank you," she said simply, attaching the holster to her belt. Fletcher's gaze lingered on the weapon. "He was the best of us, whatever he saw in you." The old agent straightened his voice, firming, "Don't make his faith misplaced." With that, he escorted them to the door. As they prepared to leave, he handed Eve a small leather pouch. "Ammunition for the Colt and a map of Phoenix, should you find yourself there, despite my advice. Marked with safe houses DEA agents have used over the years." This final gesture of assistance was unexpected. Eve tucked the pouch into her vest pocket. "I don't know how to repay this kindness." "Stay alive," Fletcher replied gruffly. "And when this business is concluded, whatever its outcome, leave the borderlands permanently. Some ghosts should remain buried." Honorary. As Eve and Diane slipped back into Tucson's waking streets, the full weight of what she had learned settled upon her. What had begun as a simple theft attempt had exploded into something far more complex, a decades-old vendetta, a missing fortune, a murdered banker who might not be dead, and former associates with uncertain loyalties. Desert Rose had once controlled these borderlands through information, through knowing every player and every angle. Now Eve found herself struggling to understand even the basic parameters of the game unfolding around her. But one thing was certain, Hammond and Reed had made this personal when they targeted her ranch. Whatever their true motivations, Whatever larger conspiracy was unfolding, Eve was now committed to seeing it through to its conclusion. The wolf was fully awake now, and the hunt was just beginning. The old mission at Santa Rosa stood silhouetted against the dawn sky, its broken bell tower reaching toward heaven like a gnarled finger. Once a place of worship and sanctuary, it had been abandoned during the last Mexican Revolution, its adobe walls now crumbling, its once sacred halls repurposed for distinctly unholy gatherings. Eve observed the structure from a ridge half a mile distant, Fletcher's brass spyglass extending her vision across the scrubby terrain. 6 horses were tethered in what had once been the mission's courtyard. 2 men stood guard at the main entrance, rifles held with the casual competence of experienced gunmen. "Escobar's men," Raphael whispered beside her, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "I recognize the one on the left. Miguel Vara, known for cutting out the tongues of informants. The medical supply run had been completed successfully 2 nights earlier. Minor complications with a border patrol checkpoint easily circumvented. Using Eve's unconventional route through a dry riverbed, Diane had been impressed enough to provide not just the promised information about Diego's meeting, but also Raphael's continued assistance. The scout's knowledge of current borderland politics and personalities had proven invaluable. "How many inside Eve?" asked, collapsing the spyglass. "At least 4, including Escobar and Diego." Raphael replied, "They meet at dawn, conclude business by mid-morning, then separate until the next gathering." Eve checked her weapons one final time. Both revolvers, fully loaded, a knife sheathed at her boot, another at her belt. After 2 decades of peaceful existence, she found herself fully armed again, prepared for violence if necessary. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Remember," she cautioned Raphael, "I need to speak with Diego alone. Creating that opportunity is our primary objective." The scout nodded, though his expression suggested skepticism. "Diego isn't the man you knew, Rose. His loyalties lie with Escobar now." "We'll see," she replied more confidently than she felt. Their plan was simple, relying on distraction rather than force. Raphael would approach the mission openly, claiming to have information about a new DEA operation that threatened Escobar's smuggling routes. While the cartel leader was occupied with this intelligence, Eve would locate Diego and secure her private conversation. Simple in theory, far more complicated in execution, particularly given Diego's reputation as Escobar's vigilant protector. "If this goes wrong," Raphael began. "It won't," Eve interrupted firmly. "But if it does, you owe me nothing. Save yourself. That's an order." The scout's mouth quivered in a half-smile. "Still giving orders, Rose?" "Old habits," she acknowledged with a wry smile of her own. They descended the ridge separately, Raphael taking the direct approach along the old mission road, while Eve circled to the rear of the structure where crumbling walls offered multiple entry points. As she moved through the landscape with practiced stealth, Eve reflected on how completely she had resumed her former identity. The past week had stripped away 20 years of Eve Morgan's careful construction, revealing Desert Rose beneath, not unchanged, but perhaps more integrated with the woman she had become during her years with Marcus. Reaching the mission's rear wall, Eve paused at a gap where adobe bricks had fallen away. Inside, voices echoed through the old chapel, men discussing territory boundaries, smuggling routes, bribes for officials, the casual business of borderland crime, conducted with the matter-of-fact tone of merchants discussing shipping rates. She slipped through the opening, finding herself in what had once been the mission's kitchen. Decades of neglect had reduced it to ruins, but the thick walls muffled her movements as she crept toward the main hall. Through a doorway, she caught glimpses of the gathering 6 men seated around a makeshift table constructed of old doors laid across barrels. At the head sat a compact, elegant Mexican with silver threading his dark hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Escobar, presumably, and there to his right a massive figure Eve would have recognized anywhere despite the passage of years. Diego had grown a beard streaked with gray, and new scars marked his face, but his imposing physical presence remained unchanged. What had altered, however, was his expression. Once thoughtful and measured, now hard, vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The eyes of a man who trusted no one expected betrayal at every turn. Eve's heart constricted at the transformation. She had known intellectually that her disappearance had changed him. Seeing the physical evidence was another matter entirely. Before she could determine how to separate him from the others, she heard Raphael's voice from the courtyard, calling for an audience with Escobar on urgent business. The guards' responses were inaudible, but moments later, heavy footsteps approached the main entrance. Diego's voice, deeper than she remembered, roughened by years, and likely tobacco, rumbled through the hall. Unexpected visitor claims to have information about DEA movements. Escobar replied with casual authority, "Bring him in, but search him thoroughly." The disruption created exactly the opportunity Eve had hoped for. As Diego and another man moved to escort Raphael inside, she slipped from the kitchen to a small room off the main hall, once the mission priest's office, now serving as storage for contraband. She positioned herself behind the door waiting. Minutes passed as Raphael delivered his carefully crafted intelligence about fictional DEA patrols. His performance was convincing. Eve could hear Escobar asking specific questions, demanding details about troop movements and timetables. Then at the perfect moment, Raphael mentioned a crossing point near Nogales, where DEA agents were supposedly establishing a permanent checkpoint. "That's your supply route from Agua Prieta," Raphael explained to Escobar. "These maps," Escobar said, interest evident in his voice. "Where are they?" "With my horse," Raphael replied smoothly. "Too valuable to carry openly into unknown territory. However, a moment of silence followed Escobar, weighing the potential value of the information against the risk of deception. "Diego," he finally ordered, "go with him. Verify these maps exist before he brings them inside." Perfect, exactly as they'd planned. Raphael would lead Diego to the supposed maps, creating the private conversation Eve sought. Heavy footsteps approached the courtyard entrance, then paused. "Luis Miguel, maintain positions," Diego instructed the guards. "No one enters or leaves until I return." Eve tensed as the footsteps faded. Now she needed to leave the mission undetected, intercept Diego and Raphael before they reached the staged map location. She slipped from her hiding place, retracing her path through the kitchen before emerging into the harsh morning sunlight through the gap in the rear wall. Circling the mission quickly but cautiously, she spotted the two men walking toward a cluster of mesquite trees where Raphael had allegedly left his horse. She paralleled their path, hidden by the undulating terrain, until she reached the trees moments before they arrived. From concealment, she watched Diego scanning the area, with professional thoroughness, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Even in this seemingly routine task, he exhibited the hypervigilance of someone who had survived by anticipating betrayal. "Where's this horse?" Diego demanded as they reached the trees. No mount was visible. Raphael shrugged apologetically. "Must have broken his tether. Desert spooks some animals." Diego's posture shifted subtly, tension radiating through his massive frame. "No horse, no maps. Feels like a setup, amigo." "Not a setup," Eve said, stepping from behind a thick mesquite trunk, both hands visible and empty. "Just a reunion long overdue." Diego's reaction was instantaneous. His revolver appeared in his hand with blinding speed, aimed unwaveringly at Eve's heart, but he didn't fire. His eyes widened with shock, recognition dawning, despite her altered appearance. "Impossible," he whispered, the gun barrel dipping slightly. "Hello, Diego," Eve said quietly. "It's been a long time." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Diego's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something darker, something between rage and grief. "You're dead," he finally stated, as if correcting an error. 20 years dead." "Evidently not," Eve replied, keeping her tone gentle, despite the weapon still pointed in her general direction. "I need to speak with you. Alone." Diego's gaze flicked to Raphael, suspicion returning. "What are you doing bringing this ghost to me?" Raphael raised his hands placatingly. "She came looking for you. I merely facilitated the meeting." "Why?" Diego demanded attention, returning to Eve. "Why now, after all this time? Why let us believe?" His voice broke unexpectedly, the crack in his composure, revealing depths of pain Eve hadn't anticipated. "Because men named Hammond and Reed are hunting me," she explained calmly. hunting Desert Rose's supposed fortune. They burned my home, threatened my life. I need to understand why. Hammond, Diego repeated, recognition flashing in his eyes. Edward Hammond. You know him. Diego's laugh held no humor. Oh yes, federal agent. Lost his partner during one of our operations near Nogales. The memory surfaced a desperate moment law enforcement, surprising them during a crossing gunfire exchanged in the darkness. The partner I shot, Hammond, survived, unfortunately. Diego lowered his gun slightly, though his vigilance hadn't diminished. He spent 20 years building evidence against Desert Rose's operation, obsessed with finding you or finding what he believes you stole. I stole plenty, Eve acknowledged, but there's no hidden fortune, whatever the rumors claim. Diego's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Know then Daniel Santiago's banking empire was built on what air? The reference to Diego's alter ego confirmed what Diane and Fletcher had suggested, the connection between her former lieutenant and the murdered banker. You established yourself well after the gang dissolved. Eve observed neutrally, legitimate success. Impressive. Built on the foundation you abandoned. Diego countered, bitterness evident. The operation's emergency funds, the networks you established, all left behind when you vanished without a word. The accusation stung, but Eve accepted its validity. I had my reasons. The DEA agent, Diego guessed, surprising her with his insight. Marcus Morgan, Diane told me years later, you'd married him, settled in Cochise County. His expression hardened. While the rest of us scattered, hunted some, caught and hanged. I'm sorry, Eve said, simply meaning it. For those who suffered for not finding a way to warn you, sorry doesn't resurrect Miguel. Diego snapped. Doesn't restore Carlos's dignity after they hanged him publicly, as an example. His massive hand tightened on his revolver. Doesn't erase 20 years of believing you died because I failed to protect you. This last admission held the key to understanding his transformation. Eve took a careful step forward, gratified when he didn't raise his weapon in response. You never failed me, Diego, she said softly. Never. The decision to leave was mine alone, a choice between prison and a different life. Terms that required abandoning everyone loyal to you. Diego finished, his voice flat. Yes, she admitted. It wasn't fair, wasn't honorable, but it was survival. Diego studied her face, searching for deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he finally holstered his weapon with a deep sigh. Why come to me now? What do you want? Information, Eve replied honestly, about Hammond, about his connection to Reed, about why they're hunting me now after all this time. Diego glanced at Raphael, who had maintained a respectful distance during their exchange. Give us privacy. The scout looked to Eve for confirmation. At her nod, he withdrew to a position where he could watch the approach from the mission without overhearing their conversation. When they were alone, Diego's posture relaxed marginally. Hammond approached me 3 months ago. In my Daniel Santiago identity, he traced banking records from our operation's legitimate fronts, followed the money to Sonoran Trust Bank. How none, Eve asked. We were careful about those transactions. We were, but patterns emerge over time. Hammond had decades to search resources I hadn't anticipated. Diego shook his head ruefully. He confronted me with evidence linking Daniel Santiago to Diego Vega, known associate of Desert Rose, threatened exposure, unless I provided information about your whereabouts and the location of your personal fortune. There is no personal fortune, Eve reiterated. Diego's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Perhaps not, but there was substantial money in our emergency cash, money that disappeared when you did. The accusation hung between them. Eve frowned, genuinely confused. I never touched the emergency funds. Whatever was in the cash when I left should have remained there. This was apparently not the answer Diego expected. He studied her face intently before responding. The cash was emptied the same night you disappeared. Over $500, $1,000 in cash and gold gone. The sum was staggering, far more than Eve had realized the operation had accumulated. I didn't take it, she insisted, Marcus and I left with nothing but our horses and essential supplies. Then who? Diego demanded Eve recalled her recent reunion with Frank, his careful evasiveness about certain topics, and his comfortable bar acquired through unspecified means. The pieces aligned with disturbing clarity. Frank took the money. She concluded, used my disappearance as cover, and let us believe you had abandoned us for your own profit. Diego added decades of misplaced bitterness evident in his voice. Let me believe it knowing how He stopped himself again, old emotions visibly surging. Before he mastered them, Eve filled in the unspoken conclusion. Diego had been devoted to her perhaps more than professionally appropriate. Her disappearance coupled with the missing funds had been a double betrayal from his perspective. I'm sorry, she said again, inadequate but sincere. For all of it. For not finding a way to tell you I was alive at least. Diego nodded once, accepting the apology without fully absolving her. Hammond didn't believe me when I denied knowledge of your whereabouts. He continued, returning to the matter at hand. He's convinced the banking empire I built was actually Desert Rose's laundered proceeds. When I refused to cooperate, he hired Reed's gang to investigate other leads, leading them to me in Cochise County. Eve concluded, exactly. Hammond is determined pathological. Even his partner's death became an obsession. He rose through the federal ranks on the strength of his pursuit of Desert Rose, even after most had forgotten your operation. When he retires next month, he wants your head as his crowning achievement. Eve absorbed this understanding. Now why Reed had appeared at her ranch, why he had shown such specific knowledge of her past. But there was still a missing piece. How did they make the connection to Eve Morgan? Even knowing Marcus's history, the tattoo, Diego said simply, Hammond had discovered references to Desert Rose's rose tattoo in accounts from former gang members who turned state's evidence. When Reed's men started watching your ranch, they reported seeing a woman bathing in the creek behind her property, a woman with a distinctive mark on her shoulder. The creek, of course. During the hottest days of summer, Eve had occasionally sought relief in the cool waters of the stream that bordered her property. Even in her seclusion, she had been observable to patient hidden watchers. So they confirmed their suspicions before ever approaching the ranch, she murmured. The attempted theft of Shadow was merely a pretense to confront you directly. To capture you, Diego corrected. Reed's instructions were to take you alive, bring you to Hammond. The fortune was secondary. He wanted confession contrition before ending Desert Rose's legend permanently. The clinical way Diego delivered this information, as if discussing a stranger's fate rather than her own, emphasized how much he had changed. The gentle, protective man who had managed their finances and mediated disputes had been replaced by someone harder, more detached. Yet he was sharing this intelligence, warning her of the danger. Some fragments of loyalty remained beneath his years of bitterness. What about Daniel Santiago's murder? Eve asked. The newspaper reported, a fabrication. Diego interrupted. When Hammond threatened exposure, I activated contingency plans. Staged the murder, made it appear the bank was robbed to eliminate financial motive. Daniel Santiago is officially dead. His assets transferred through various fronts before his murder. Eve couldn't help but admire the strategy Pure Desert Rose in its elegant problem-solving, clever. And now I'm Diego Vega again, Escobar's right hand. Different identity, different power base. His eyes met hers directly. Different loyalties. The warning was clear. Whatever bond they had once shared was severed. He had provided information out of a sense of closure, perhaps, but would not actively assist her against Hammond or Reed. I understand, Eve acknowledged. Thank you for the truth, at least. Diego nodded, then glanced toward the mission. I should return before Escobar sends men looking for me. Discovery of this meeting would be problematic. As he turned to leave, Eve asked one final question. If you could do it again, knowing I left to save myself not for money or betrayal, would you have made different choices these past 20 years? Diego paused, considering the question with genuine thoughtfulness. No, he finally replied. Your disappearance forced me to become self-reliant, to build something of my own. Daniel Santiago accomplished things Diego Vega never could have. A ghost of his old smile touched his weathered face. Though I might have killed fewer men along the way, had I known the truth earlier. With that, he strode away, rejoining Raphael for the walk back to the mission. Eve watched him go, recognizing that some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt. The past was immutable. All that remained was addressing the present danger Hammond and Reed represented. She had the information she needed now. Understanding Hammond's motivations clarified her options, limited though they were. A man driven by 20 years of obsessive pursuit wouldn't be deterred by reason or bribery. His retirement looming, he wanted Desert Rose's capture as his legacy. Eve waited until Diego and Raphael had reached a respectful distance before emerging from the mesquite thicket. Her path forward was clear. Hammond would never stop hunting Desert Rose. But perhaps Desert Rose could hunt him first. 3 days later, Eve stood on a ridge overlooking the Phoenix Railroad yards, observing the modest house where Edward Hammond had established his base of operations. Fletcher's intelligence network had proven invaluable, providing not just the location, but detailed information about Hammond's habits, security measures, and timetable. The federal agent maintained meticulous routines: breakfast at precisely 7 her departure for his office at 8:15, return at 6 hour for dinner. Each evening, he spent 2 hours in his study, updating his extensive files on border criminal operations, particularly those related to Desert Rose. Tonight would be his last opportunity to complete those records, though he didn't know it yet. The rear entrance has a single guard. Raphael reported, crawling up beside her after completing his reconnaissance. Another man watching the street out front. Both armed but casual, they're not expecting trouble. Eve nodded, unsurprised. Hammond believed himself the hunter, not the hunted. His focus would be on coordinating Reed's efforts to recapture her trail after losing her at the burned ranch. Watch positions. None that I detected. Raphael replied, "This isn't a military operation, just a man with hired guns and a personal vendetta." Diane, who had insisted on accompanying them, despite Eve's objections, handed Raphael a canteen. Reed himself. No sign likely, still in the field searching for Rose. This aligned with Eve's assessment. Hammond would maintain his established routine, directing the hunt from a distance while maintaining his respectable federal position. With retirement just weeks away, he couldn't risk direct involvement in anything questionable. We move at dusk. Eve decided Diane and Raphael create the diversion at the main federal office. I handle Hammond. The plan had been refined over the past days, each participant contributing expertise from their current lives, as well as their past experiences with Desert Rose's operation. It was elegant in its simplicity. Isolate Hammond from his support structure, confront him directly, eliminate the threat he posed. Not through violence as the younger Desert Rose might have done, but through a more sophisticated approach that Eve Morgan had conceived. As darkness fell, they moved into position. Diane and Raphael departed for the federal headquarters, where a strategically set fire in an outbuilding would draw attention and resources away from Hammond's residence. Eve approached from the west, using the railroad tracks themselves as cover, before crossing to the residential street where Hammond's house stood illuminated by newly installed electric lights. The technological progress of the past 20 years never ceased to surprise Eve. Phoenix had transformed from a dusty territorial capital to a modern city during her seclusion in Cochise County. The diversion worked perfectly. Fire bells began clanging throughout the federal complex, drawing Hammond's exterior guards toward the commotion. Along with most residents of the surrounding blocks, Eve dispatched the single remaining watchman with practiced efficiency, using a sleeper hold rather than lethal force. Minutes later, she stood in Hammond's study, her revolver, Marcus's revolver, trained on the federal agent himself, as he sat rigidly in his chair. His initially outraged protests had silenced when he recognized her. He was older than Eve had expected, perhaps 65, with thinning white hair and the pallid complexion of a man who spent his life indoors among papers rather than under the borderland sun. His eyes, however, burned with an intensity that confirmed Diego's assessment of obsession. "Desert Rose," he said, finally breaking the tense silence. "After all these years." "Mr. Hammond," Eve acknowledged with a calm she didn't entirely feel. This man had dedicated his life to hunting her and had nearly succeeded in destroying everything she'd built. "I believe we have matters to discuss." "Nothing to discuss." Hammond replied, his voice surprisingly steady, given the circumstances. You murdered my partner, David Hammond, stole thousands in government funds, led a criminal enterprise that terrorized the border for years. Ancient history, Eve countered, 20 years past. Justice has no expiration date. Hammond's gaze was unflinching. Neither does my commitment to seeing you hang for your crimes. Eve studied him thoughtfully. Diego had been right. Reason wouldn't sway a man so consumed by his mission, but perhaps another approach might. Your files, she said, gesturing to the cabinets lining the office walls. 20 years of investigation, quite impressive. Comprehensive. Hammond's expression betrayed surprise at this change of subject. The most complete record of borderland criminal operations ever assembled. My legacy to the federal authorities. Yes, I've been admiring your thoroughness. Eve retrieved a thick folder from her satchel papers Raphael had quietly removed from Hammond's office during previous reconnaissance, particularly your documentation of federal corruption in 3 territories. Governor Wilson's involvement in land theft from native reservations, Senator Mitchell's financial interests in companies using Chinese labor illegally. Hammond's face drained of what little color it possessed. Those are confidential materials, part of ongoing investigations. Investigations you've never quite completed. Eve noted, perhaps because the evidence implicated too many powerful men whose political support your agency requires. She opened the folder, displaying knowledge of its contents that clearly unsettled Hammond. Your dilemma is understandable. Exposing such corruption would damage the very institutions you've served loyally. Yet bearing the evidence compromises the justice you claim to hold sacred. Hammond's hands tightened on his chair arms. What exactly are you proposing? A trade, Eve replied simply. Your obsessive pursuit of Desert Rose ends today. Permanently, Reed's men are recalled. All files relating to me and my former operation are destroyed, not just here, but in all official repositories where you've shared information. And in exchange, Hammond asked professional interest overcoming his personal animosity. Eve placed the folder on his desk. In exchange, these documents and others like them that I've secured remain private. The powerful men whose crimes you've documented never learn how close you came to exposing them. Blackmail, Hammond summarized flatly, mutual assured destruction. Eve corrected. You've spent 20 years building a case against a ghost from the past. Meanwhile, I've spent 3 days compiling evidence that would make you enemies of the most influential figures in the territorial politics. Hammond's expression remained passive, but calculation showed behind his eyes. My retirement begins in 3 weeks. The Desert Rose case would have been my crowning achievement. Find another achievement, Eve suggested, one less likely to trigger revelations about judicial corruption and political malfeasance. For nearly a minute, Hammond sat motionless, weighing options, assessing threats. Eve maintained steady eye contact. Her posture relaxed despite the tension coursing through her. This gambit would either secure her future safety or escalate the danger exponentially. Finally, Hammond sighed, a sound of resignation rather than defeat. You always were smarter than the average criminal, Desert Rose. It's why you remained uncaptured during your active years. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't intended as one. Hammond straightened in his chair. Very well, I accept your proposal with one condition. Name it. Etched. I want confirmation of what happened to the missing government funds from the Nogales robbery. $30,000 never recovered. For 20 years, I believed you secured it before disappearing. The question surprised Eve. Of all the crimes associated with Desert Rose's operation, this particular robbery held special significance for Hammond beyond his partner's death. The money was distributed among my people before I left, she answered truthfully, standard procedure for all operations. There was no hidden cash despite the rumors. Hammond studied her face, seeking deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. As I suspected, Hammond died for relatively little. Then your Lieutenant Diego received perhaps $3,000 as his share. Hardly worth a man's life. No amount would have been, Eve acknowledged quietly. If it matters, I never intended death for your partner or anyone else. Violence was always a last resort in my operation. Cold comfort for David's widow and children, Hammond replied bitterly. But what's done is done. He stood carefully, hands visible to avoid alarming her. I presume you'll want my files on Desert Rose as evidence of compliance. Everything, Eve confirmed, including any copies stored elsewhere. Hammond crossed to a cabinet, withdrew several thick folders. 20 years of investigation rendered worthless in a single negotiation. He placed the materials on his desk with obvious reluctance. I assume your people will verify my compliance thoroughly? They will, Eve assured him, including confirmation that Reed's men are recalled. They will be, Hammond said, though Reed himself may be difficult to control. He's developed a personal interest in capturing you since your encounter at the ranch. I'll handle Reed if necessary, Eve replied with enough quiet confidence that Hammond's eyebrows rose slightly. I almost believe you could, he murmured. Very well, our business is concluded. May we never meet again. As Eve gathered Hammond's files, securing them in her satchel, she corrected him one final time. Desert Rose is dead, Mr. Hammond. She died 20 years ago, as your official reports will now confirm. I'm merely Eve Morgan, a widow seeking a peaceful continuation of her life. Hammond's smile held no warmth. We both know that's not entirely true. The wolf may sleep, but her teeth remain sharp. He returned to his desk, the matter settled with the pragmatism of a man who had survived decades in borderland law enforcement. Good evening, Mrs. Morgan. I trust you can see yourself out. As Eve slipped away into the night, she reflected on Hammond's parting words. Was he right? Had Desert Rose merely been sleeping all these years, waiting for the right moment to reawaken? Or had Eve Morgan, the woman she'd become with Marcus, been the truer self? Perhaps both identities were real. Perhaps the woman who had ruthlessly controlled a smuggling empire and the woman who had tenderly nursed her dying husband were not so different after all, two sides of the same rose thorns and petals equally essential to survival. Whatever the truth, she had secured her immediate safety. Hammond would honor their agreement. Men like him always did when the alternative was their own destruction. Reed remained a potential threat, but she would deal with him when and if he surfaced. For now, she had a more personal matter to address. She had one final conversation to hold before she could truly decide who she would be in the years ahead. The moon rose full and bright over the Sonoran Desert as Eve Morgan stood at the grave of her husband. The small cemetery outside Bisbee was silent, except for the occasional call of a nightbird and the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. Marcus's headstone was simple granite, just as he would have wanted. No ostentatious declarations, just his name dates and the words, beloved husband, man of honor. Eve knelt beside the grave, brushing desert dust from the stone with gentle fingers. I should have come sooner, she said softly. I'm sorry for that, but things got complicated. She settled more comfortably on the hard ground, as if preparing for a long conversation. Hammond is no longer a threat. I handled it without bloodshed. You'd have been proud of that at least. The night air carried the scent of creosote and sage, familiar smells of the desert they had both come to love. Eve drew her jacket tighter against the evening chill. Frank took the emergency cash. She continued, her voice steady. Let Diego and the others believe I'd betrayed them. I wonder if you knew you never spoke of him when you told me which of my people had been caught, which had escaped. Was that deliberate? Only the desert silence answered her. Diego became a banker of all things, built something legitimate from his share. Then Hammond found him, and now he's back with the cartels. She sighed. People adapt, survive, however they can. You taught me that. Eve pulled Marcus's revolver from its holster, turning it over in her hands, watching moonlight glint off the pearl grips. Fletcher returned this to me. Said it was fitting your widow should have it now. I think he suspects I'm not quite the reformed character you made me out to be. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another further away. Eve listened to their exchange, remembering nights on the ranch when she and Marcus had sat on the porch, tracking the coyotes' conversations across the darkness. The ranch is gone, she said after a moment. Reed and his men burned it after they escaped custody. Not much left worth salvaging, according to Alvarez. But Shadow survived. Diane's people found him in a livestock auction in Phoenix. recognized his markings. She reached into her pocket, withdrew the silver medallion, her badge of leadership from another life. I'm wearing this again. Didn't plan to, but it feels right somehow. Like something that was missing has been restored. Eve fell silent, struggling with the question that had haunted her since Hammond's parting words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Who am I, Marcus? The woman you married or the one you were sent to arrest? Have I been playing at redemption all these years, or playing at wickedness before that? The headstone offered no answers, but speaking the questions aloud seemed to diminish their power. Eve had always known who she was, a survivor. Everything else was just a role assumed to ensure that survival. I made a deal with Hammond. She continued, her practical nature reasserting itself. My freedom for his secrets. He'll honor it. Men like him always do. But Reed's still out there. Wounded pride, personal vendetta now. She holstered the revolver with a decisive movement. I'll handle him. One last piece of business. Then, she hesitated. Then I don't know. Can't go back to the ranch. Too many people know the connection now. Might head north, Montana maybe, or east to Texas, somewhere. I can start fresh again. Eve traced the letters of Marcus's name on the headstone. Would you recognize me now, I wonder? The woman I've become these past weeks, would you still love her? The question lingered in the desert air, unanswerable, yet somehow necessary to ask. After a moment, Eve rose to her feet, brushing dust from her clothing. I loved you, Marcus Morgan. Never doubt that whatever else I was, whatever else I am, I loved you truly. She placed a single desert wildflower on the grave, a red bloom that somehow thrived in the harsh landscape. Goodbye, my love. I'll return when I can, when it's safe. As she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beyond the cemetery gates. Eve's hand dropped to her holster, but she didn't draw, paying final respects. Mrs. Morgan. Jackson Reed's voice carried clearly through the still night. How touching, Eve assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. Reed stood 30 yards away, partially concealed by a juniper tree. She couldn't see a weapon but assumed he was armed. The cemetery offered little cover, a few scattered tombstones, nothing substantial. Mr. Reed, she acknowledged calmly, I wondered when you'd reappear. Did you think I'd just walk away after what you did? Reed's voice carried the bitter edge of wounded pride. 2 of my men dead, my reputation in tatters. You came to my home uninvited. Eve reminded him, threatened me, burned my ranch. Any consequences were of your own making. Reed stepped fully into the moonlight. He looked haggard, his clothing trail, worn, his face gaunt beneath the mustache, but his eyes burned with the same cruel determination she'd seen at their first meeting. Hammond's called off the hunt. He said, confirming what Eve had suspected. He'd already contacted his employer. Says the Desert Rose case is closed, officially inactive. Then you should follow his example. Eve suggested, find other employment, move on. Reed barked a harsh laugh. Move on after 20 years chasing whispers and rumors, after finally finding the legendary Desert Rose living as a respectable widow. Do you have any idea how many men would pay for that information? Eve tensed. This was what she had feared, Reed acting independently, selling her identity to the highest bidder. The hunt would never end if bounty hunters and sensation seekers believed Desert Rose had resurfaced. Hammond's protection won't extend to private ventures. Reed continued, taking a step closer. I've already had interest from certain parties in Mexico. Families of men, your operation killed cartels whose territories you invaded. They'd pay handsomely for your location. And you think I'll just let you walk away with that information? Eve kept her voice level, though adrenaline was beginning to course through her system. Oh, I don't expect to walk away at all. Reed drew his revolver with deliberate slowness. Not until I've settled our personal account. Eve made no move toward her own weapon. Is that why you came alone? Personal vengeance. Who says I came alone? Eve had anticipated this. Reed was many things, but he wasn't foolish enough to confront Desert Rose without backup. She had sensed the presence of others from the moment she entered the cemetery, subtle disturbances in the natural rhythm of the desert night. "Your men are already neutralized, Mr. Reed." As if on cue, Raphael and Diane emerged from the shadows behind Reed, weapons trained on his back. "Drop the gun, cowboy!" Diane ordered, her voice hard with authority. Reed's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't lower his weapon or turn to face the new threat. "Two against one. Still better odds than you gave Myers and Perkins." "I count 3 against 1, Eve corrected calmly. "Unless you believe I'm unarmed." For a tense moment, no one moved. Eve could almost see the calculations running behind Reed's eyes, weighing his chances, considering options, perhaps even contemplating a suicidal charge. Finally, with exaggerated care, he lowered his revolver to the ground. "Kick it away," Raphael instructed. Reed complied, sending the weapon skittering across the hard earth. "Now what?" he asked, a mocking edge to his voice. "Going to kill me in a cemetery seems fitting for Desert Rose." "If I wanted you dead, you would be," Eve replied, echoing Fletcher's words to her. "This isn't about vengeance, Mr. Reed. It's about survival, mine and yours." She approached him slowly, maintaining a cautious distance. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave Arizona territory tonight. Head east, west, north, I don't care which. But if I ever hear your name again, if I ever catch a whisper that you're selling information about me, I'll find you." "Empty threats," Reed sneered. "The Desert Rose I heard about wouldn't waste time with warnings. The Desert Rose you heard about died 20 years ago." Eve said, "I'm what's left. A woman who's learned that killing creates more problems than it solves." She held his gaze, letting him see the truth in her eyes. "But make no mistake, Mr. Reed. If protecting my peace means returning to old habits, I won't hesitate." Something in her expression must have convinced him, because the mockery faded from his face, replaced by a wariness that hadn't been there before. "What's to stop me from coming back once your watchdogs aren't around?" Eve smiled without humor. "Did you know that Miguel Vera Escobar's enforcer is particularly talented at finding men who don't wish to be found? Diego speaks very highly of his methods." Reed's face paled visibly in the moonlight. "You're bluffing. The cartels wouldn't work with you. Old loyalties run deep in the borderlands." Diane interjected, "Deeper than you might imagine." It was a bluff, of course. Diego had made it clear he wanted no part in Eve's problems, but Reed didn't need to know that. "You have until dawn to be across the territorial line," Eve said with finality. "After that, I make no promises about your continued health." Reed's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of genuine defeat. "And if I comply, if I disappear, then we never see each other again. Simple as that." Eve stepped back, gesturing for Raphael to secure Reed's discarded weapon. "Your horse is still tied at the cemetery entrance. I'd suggest you don't waste time." Reed studied her face one last time, perhaps searching for weakness or deception. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. "You know, Mrs. Morgan, I almost wish I'd met you in your prime. Would have been something to see Desert Rose in her full glory." "No," Eve said quietly. "You wouldn't have survived the encounter." Ahem. Without another word, Reed turned and walked toward the cemetery gates, his posture rigid with suppressed rage, but his steps steady with the pragmatism of a man who knew when he was beaten. They watched in silence until he mounted his horse and rode away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the desert night. "Will he stay gone?" Raphael asked, handing Reed's revolver to Eve. She examined the weapon briefly before emptying its chambers and tossing it among the graves. "Yes, whatever else he is, Reed's a survivor. He knows a losing proposition when he sees one. And if he doesn't," Diane pressed Eve's expression, hardened momentarily, a flash of Desert Rose showing through Eve Morgan's composed exterior, "then I'll handle it permanently." The three stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past week settling around them like the desert dust. Finally, Diane spoke the question they'd all been avoiding. "What now? Rose, where do you go from here?" Eve looked back at Marcus's grave, the small red flower barely visible in the moonlight. "I don't know," she admitted. "Can't go back to the ranch. Too many connections, too many memories. You could come to Tucson." Diane suggested, "The bank always needs good managers, people who understand both sides of the law." Eve smiled faintly, tempting. But I think I need something different, somewhere new. Colorado's peaceful this time of year. Raphael offered good ranching country in the southern valleys, far enough from the border that old ghosts rarely visit. The idea had merit a fresh start in a place where neither Desert Rose nor Eve Morgan had history. Somewhere she could fashion a new identity, or perhaps integrate the fragments of who she had been into someone whole. Maybe she said not committing, but not rejecting either. First, there's something I need to do. Her companions recognized the tone a decision made not to be questioned. Whatever Eve planned, she would do it alone. You know how to reach us if you need anything, Diane said, touching Eve's arm lightly. The family may be scattered, but it still exists. Family. The word resonated in a way Eve hadn't expected. For 20 years, she had lived as if her past was a closed book. The connections severed the debts paid. But these past weeks had shown her that nothing truly ended. Not loyalty, not obligation, not the consequences of choices made decades ago. Thank you, she said, simply meaning it, for more than just the current offer of assistance. As Diane and Raphael prepared to depart, Eve remained by the grave for one final moment of solitude. The desert night wrapped around her familiar and strange, simultaneously like her own identity. Something both known and mysterious. Whatever came next, she would face it without illusions. Not as Desert Rose, criminal mastermind of the borderlands. Not as Eve Morgan, respectable rancher's widow. But as herself, a woman who had lived both lives and survived to tell the tale. A woman with thorns and petals, both equally true. The morning sun cast long shadows across the forecourt of the Tucson Federal Building, as Eve Morgan, dressed in a proper widow's black, her hair restored to its natural copper red, approached the main entrance with measured steps. 2 weeks had passed since her confrontation with Reed at the cemetery. 2 weeks of careful planning, of tying loose ends, of making peace with decisions long delayed. Passers-by gave her respectful nods, the deference automatically accorded to a widow in mourning. None would have connected this dignified woman with the outlaw known as Desert Rose. At the reception desk, she stated her business in clear, confident tones. I'm here to see Deputy Director Fletcher. I believe he's expecting me. The young clerk checked his ledger, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, Mr. Fletcher mentioned you might be calling third floor, end of the hall. Eve thanked him and made her way up the broad staircase, her boots echoing on the marble steps. The federal building was a monument to civilization's advance into the Wild West. Electric lights, polished floors, uniformed guards, a far cry from the dusty, violent borderlands where she had made her name. Fletcher's office door stood open. He looked up from his desk as she approached, his expression revealing nothing but professional courtesy. Mrs. Morgan, please come in. Eve entered, closing the door behind her. Fletcher gestured to a chair, which she took with a nod of thanks. I must admit, he said after a moment, I didn't expect to see you again. Certainly not here. Seemed appropriate, Eve replied, full circle in a way. Fletcher's one good arm reached for a crystal decanter on his credenza. Drink, it's only 11, but some conversations benefit from social lubricant. When Eve nodded, he poured 2 fingers of bourbon into matching glasses, sliding one across the desk to her. To unlikely meetings, he offered as a toast. Eve raised her glass slightly. To unexpected allies. They drank in silence, the smooth liquor burning pleasantly. Fletcher set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he had shown at their first meeting. Hammond submitted his retirement paperwork yesterday. He said conversationally, effective immediately cited health concerns. A wise decision. Eve replied, equally casual, indeed. And all files relating to a certain borderland operation have been mysteriously reclassified, sealed under national security protocols. Quite unusual. Bureaucracy works in mysterious ways. The ghost of a smile touched Fletcher's weathered face. So it does. He took another sip of bourbon. Reed crossed into New Mexico territory last week. Hasn't been seen since. Also wise. Fletcher set his glass down with deliberate precision. You've been busy, Mrs. Morgan. Cleaning house, as it were. Tying loose ends, Eve corrected. ensuring a peaceful retirement. For yourself, for everyone concerned. Fletcher nodded slowly, accepting this. And what brings you to my office? More loose ends. Eve reached into her handbag and withdrew a slim envelope, placing it on the desk between them. A peace offering of sorts. Fletcher made no move to take it. What is it? Information. Eve said simply. The names and locations of 3 cartel leaders currently operating in Arizona territory, their shipping routes, their banking connections, everything your department would need to dismantle their organizations completely. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. That's extremely valuable intelligence. Why offer it to me? Consider it payment for your assistance. And, Eve hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An acknowledgement that some debts can never be fully repaid, but gestures toward balance still matter. Fletcher opened the envelope, glancing at its contents. His expression remained controlled, but Eve could see the professional assessment in his eyes, recognizing the value and authenticity of what she had provided. This information could save lives. He said finally, prevent significant criminal activity. I know. Interesting moral calculus from Desert Rose. Eve met his gaze directly from Eve Morgan, a woman trying to make what amends she can. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, then carefully returned the papers to the envelope. This information never came from you, for your own protection. I would prefer that, Eve agreed. And after this gesture of goodwill, what then? Eve took a final sip of bourbon, letting the warmth spread through her chest before answering. I'm leaving Arizona, starting fresh somewhere new. Following my advice at last, Fletcher observed, where will you go? Better you don't know better. No one knows, for a while at least. Fletcher nodded, understanding the wisdom in this approach. And the others, Diane Raphael. They've made their choices, built lives here. I won't disrupt them again. A comfortable silence settled between them. Former hunter and hunted, now bound by a strange respect that transcended their history. Marcus would be proud, Fletcher said, finally, his voice gentler than Eve had ever heard it, of the choice you're making now. The mention of her husband brought a familiar ache, but no longer the sharp pain of fresh grief. I hope so. Eve rose to leave, extending her hand across the desk. After a moment's hesitation, Fletcher took it in a firm grip. Good luck, Mrs. Morgan, or whatever name you choose next. Thank you for everything. As Eve turned to go, Fletcher called after her. One last question, if you'll permit it. She paused at the doorway. Yes, was it worth it? The life you built with Marcus, leaving everything else behind. Eve considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. It was different, she said, finally echoing what she had told Frank weeks earlier. Quieter, sometimes harder, in ways I hadn't expected, but yes, it was worth every moment. Fletcher nodded, seemingly satisfied. Safe travels, then. Goodbye, Deputy Director. Siktorn. As Eve descended the marble staircase, she felt a weight lifting, not just the immediate danger of Hammond and Reed, but something deeper, older. A burden she had carried for 20 years without fully acknowledging it. Outside, the Tucson street bustled with midday activity, merchants hawking wares, horses and automobiles sharing the dusty road. The new century asserting itself in 100 small ways. Eve paused on the steps, adjusting her hat against the bright sunlight. A familiar figure waited beside a wagon at the bottom of the steps. Diane, elegant, as always, in a tailored traveling suit. Is it done? She asked as Eve approached. It's done, Eve confirmed, all accounts settled. Diane nodded toward the wagon. Your things are packed, shadows tied behind as you requested. Eve glanced at the modest collection of trunks and bags, all that remained of her life in Arizona. You didn't need to do this. Consider it my parting gift. Diane's practical tone belied the emotion in her eyes. The stage leaves for Colorado in an hour. You'll want to make your connection. Eve took Diane's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. Thank you for everything. Just don't disappear completely this time, Diane said, a hint of her old sharpness returning. The occasional letter wouldn't kill you. Eve smiled, the expression softening the lines that weeks of tension had etched around her eyes. I promise. Though purely social correspondence, of course. Of course. They embraced briefly, the gesture, awkward but sincere, two women who had traveled a long, complicated road together and now found themselves at different forks. Frank, Eve asked, naming the one loose end she hadn't been able to tie herself. Diane's expression turned enigmatic. He understands the situation, won't be a problem. Eve didn't press for details. Some solutions were better left unexamined. Take care of yourself, Diane. And you, Rosie. The use of her old nickname, not Desert Rose, but the more intimate version only her closest associates had used, brought a sudden tightness to Eve's throat. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, then climbed onto the wagon's bench and took up the reins. As she guided the horses down Tucson's main street for the last time, Eve allowed herself a moment to look back, not just at Diane's diminishing figure, but at the life she was leaving behind. 20 years as Eve Morgan, 3 weeks as the resurrected Desert Rose. Both identities had shaped her, defined her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Perhaps in Colorado she would find a synthesis. Not Desert Rose, not Eve Morgan, but someone new. Someone who carried the strength and cunning of the outlaw and the compassion and patience of the widow. Someone at peace with her thorns and her petals alike. The road stretched before her, winding north toward distant mountains and unfamiliar horizons. Shadow trotted steadily behind the wagon, his dappled coat gleaming in the Arizona sun. Eve adjusted her grip on the reins and faced forward. Whatever came next, she would meet it on her own terms. The rose might change its name, might bloom in different soil, but it would grow, it would endure. It always had.